Welcome back to God Jack Joan, the home of epic adventures, powerful heroes, and stories. We will see second part. What if Harry Potter was Snape's son? Here is short summary. What if a routine Hogwarts investigation uncovered a secret that changed everything? As new measures expose the abuse Harry Potter has suffered for years, Professor Snape is forced to confront a shocking truth, one that ties his fate to Harry's in ways neither could have imagined. With long-buried secrets revealed and powerful bonds forged, Harry's life takes a dramatic turn that could reshape the wizarding world forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another adventure. Now, grab your wand, prepare for the unexpected, and let's dive into today's story. The instructions for that variation weren't available, except to 7th years. The process wasn't difficult, nor the knowledge restricted, but it would have required some digging to find. The variation was generally only used for those who required it for specific circumstances. Severus knew that this had been no mere gesture. The child had meant it. Whatever pain she was suffering, she was serious that she wanted it to end. Miss Weasley had gone about it with all the determination of a Hufflepuff, the intelligence of a Ravenclaw and the deviousness of a Slytherin. Dumbledore had conjured a stretcher for Minerva, she was already asleep on it. He had offered to conjure one for Severus, but his expression must have been answer enough for the headmaster. Poppy had similarly glared daggers at Dumbledore, before requesting loudly that a house elf bring herself and Severus a pepper-up potion from the hospital wing. It was a good thing she had. It hadn't occurred to Severus, at all, a testament to his weariness, and he would not have made it without one. Make some good, strong coffee, perhaps Turkish, and bring some food, as well. Severus likes scones. I'd like some meat pies, Poppy said to the house elf, before it popped off, and chocolate, some sandwiches, and... oh, just bring up a whole tray. Enough for all of us. We'll be starving. You know what we like. It had taken a few more moments for Miss Lloyd to help he and Poppy maneuver Miss Weasley's stretcher out of the portrait hole. Severus was looking forward to a cup of that coffee. Why would she do something like that? One of the Weasley brothers asked in a whisper, finally. I don't know. Sighed Dumbledore. He was walking alongside Minerva's stretcher, behind Severus, Poppy and Miss Lloyd, who had Miss Weasley's. I would like to talk to all of you, before Miss Weasley wakes up. Perhaps we can find some clue. Do you think you know who could be still possessing her? One of the other boys asked. Severus was too tired to keep track. No, Mr. Weasley, replied the headmaster, gently, although, I do believe that very likely has something to do with it. She will be all right, though? Granger asked. Her voice sounded incongruously cool and serene. Thanks to your quick thinking, Miss Granger, and Miss Lloyd's, yes. Dumbledore said. Where did you learn that particular Muggle technique? Mum and Dad made me take a Red Cross CL, last summer. Granger replied, quietly, I thought it was stupid at the time. How many wizards have heart attacks? But, Mum said I had to. And Miss Lloyd, I'm Muggleborn too, Professor, remember? The blonde girl replied, I took it when I started minding my niece. My sister wouldn't let me, until I took child and infant CPR and the rest. She's really fussy, Lloyd said shyly. I suppose points to Gryffindor are in order then, twinkled the headmaster, even given the grimness of the situation. I'd say, bloody special award for not allowing another Ing ghost to be added to this bloody Ing school, muttered Severus. Poppy and Miss Lloyd glanced at him. Poppy in amusement, Lloyd in shock. Had he said that out loud? Merlin, he must be tired. He'd be sounding like his father coming off a shift, in a minute. Resolutely, he decided to keep his mouth shut, until he had a strong cup of coffee in him and at least another pepper-up. Pomona came bustling down the corridor with Potter in tow. It appeared the boy had some presence of mind. Severus, Poppy, Mr. Potter told me Miss Weasley was hurt. She took in the 2 stretchers and the whole cavalcade of them. We had to use Tribuo Vita, Pomona, Poppy said, softly, Minerva's knackered. Severus and I aren't far behind. Pomona's eyes widened. Right then. The 3 of you, into bed. She ordered, matter-of-factly, I'll look after the patient. I've already owled St. Mungo's, from what Mr. Potter told me, we'll need a couple of their healers. Pomona took Poppy's arm and gestured to Lloyd to bring Miss Weasley's stretcher along. The 4 Weasley boys followed it. Severus let go of the stretcher and realized that was, perhaps, not a wise idea. He felt his legs tremble, so he leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. Someone grabbed his elbow, steadying him, guiding him into a chair that someone must have conjured. Small hands. Severus cracked his eyes open, realizing the hands belonged to Potter. "Damn him. Are you all right?" the boy asked, sounding concerned. "Fine," grunted Severus. The headmaster must have conjured the chair. It was his signature squashy armchair sort of thing. There was no urgency for Severus to get into the hospital wing. They would do well enough on their own for a few minutes. He closed his eyes again, waiting for the weakness to pee. A small noise let him know that Potter was still there. Why was the damned boy still standing there? Couldn't he go offer comfort or support or whatever to the other Weasleys? "What, Potter?" Severus growled, leaning his head back. "Can I get you something?" Potter asked, softly. "Some of that coffee Madame Pomfrey ordered. With a lot of sugar. 5 or 6 teaspoons, at least," Severus replied, without opening his eyes. If he gave the tea something to do, he wouldn't stand there, staring at him. It seemed merely a second before the unmistakable smell of coffee, redolent with the smell of cinnamon and cardamom, roused Severus from his almost doze. He opened his eyes with an effort. "Sir." Potter held out an absolutely enormous cup of coffee. "Professor Sprout said it already had sugar in it and it didn't need milk. Professor Dumbledore wants to know if you need him to come and fetch you." "Absolutely not." Severus tried to snarl, but it was only an irritable mutter. He took the mug of coffee in both hands, gulping it down, even though it was hot enough to burn his tongue. Inwardly he nodded approval. It was thick Turkish stuff, boiled with the sugar in it. Hot as hell, black as the devil, sweet as a stolon. A moment ped. Severus closed his eyes again, cradled the mug with the thick dregs in the bottom in his lap, waiting for the caffeine and sugar to hit his in. He didn't like to use any stronger stimulants, they could damage him, in this state. The spell normally required 3 people, so they were fortunate that Minerva had known enough about the spell to east. It would have been a risk, to do it with just 2 of them. Severus didn't know if he would have wanted Poppy to take the risk. She wasn't as old as Minerva, true, but she also wasn't either as young or, in all honesty, as powerful as Severus. What Poppy lacked in pure power, she made up for in knowledge and technique. They couldn't afford to lose her, or her skills. People depended on Poppy. It wouldn't have killed Severus, if he's done it alone, in all probability. It most likely wouldn't have even badly damaged him, but Dumbledore would have needed to find a replacement potions master for the rest of the term. And a replacement guardian for Potter, he suddenly realized. Damn it, he was too tired to think about that, right now. It was very comfortable to just drift off, with his head leaning back on the chair. Professor, you're going to tip that," a distant voice told him. He felt the mug plucked out of his hands. He didn't understand why Lily was referring to him as Professor. At least, it sounded like Lily's voice. Maybe, had to be, because now she'd thrown a blanket over him. His dad must have chucked him out of the house again. He hoped Mrs. Evans wasn't going to be angry when she found him, kipping in her living room. He drifted further off into a comfortable blackness. Severus heard the sound of a flow and started a little. He shook his head and opened his eyes properly. How long had he been dozing? The boy had found a chair and was sitting there, staring at his own cup of something. "How long have I slept?" Severus demanded, harshly. "About half an hour," replied Potter, looking up with fear-haunted eyes. "I think the healers are here." Severus staggered to his feet. Potter was there at his elbow, and if Severus hadn't been so truly weak and off balance he would have shouted at the boy. As it was, he grudgingly put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Right. He staggered into the hospital wing, with the boy half supporting him. He scowled at the headmaster's raised eyebrows, daring him to comment. Potter led him to the first chair and Severus sat down, collapsed. Really. Poppy and Minerva were sound asleep, on 2 of the beds. The Weasley boys were gathered, at the near end with Granger and Lloyd. The headmaster appeared to be getting ready to question them with them. "Where is Miss Weasley?" asked Severus. He didn't bother to keep his voice down. Nothing would wake either Poppy or Minerva for some hours, if they'd gotten properly to sleep. Dumbledore pointed to the end of the hospital wing where a curtained-off area hid the activity of what appeared to be several healers. They just arrived by flew from St. Mungo's. He said, they were wondering if, before Mr. and Mrs. Weasley get here, if you might be able to get some idea from Ginny why she would do something like this. She hasn't recovered enough to speak yet, asked Severus, heavily. Then he knew the answer, before the headmaster shook his head. Oh, of course, he said, almost to himself. An overdose of peace would leave the child paralyzed, for several days, even her breathing would need to be induced magically. Any of the antidotes for peace would kill her, now. One could only wait for it to wear off, by itself. The Tribuo Vita would keep her heart alive until the potion wore off, but she was in for a frightening few days. Severus said, bitterly, I'll need more of that coffee, then. Potter jumped up, like a bloody house elf, before Severus was even done speaking. Dumbledore turned to the children. Do any of you know why Ginny might do such a thing as this? As one, the children all shook their heads in a muddled, bemused sort of way. She's been really down, all term, but it's not like that hasn't been going around, one of the twins said. The other one nodded. Mum told us to keep an eye on her. She seemed to cheer up the last couple of days, though. Well, I haven't noticed anything, said the oldest one, Percy Weasley. She's actually been very interested in her studies this year. Much more so than last. She's been very interested in improving her potion marks. I've been helping her. Considering that Miss Weasley had spent a great deal of last year being possessed by some fragment of the Dark Lord, it was no wonder she had not been interested in her studies. Potter came back with Severus coffee and some variety of baked good. He put both into Severus' hands and then took his seat between Granger and the youngest Weasley boy. Do you know who she was close to? Asked Dumbledore gently. Anyone at all, who we should ask? Granger said in a very soft, overly composed voice, I've been thinking about it, Professor. I can't think of anyone Ginny was close to, other than us and Neville. Last year was such a wreck for her, you see. The only person I ever saw her with was Neville. She paused. Severus noted her eyes were a little unfocused. You know, she told me that I had to go to the teachers about Harry. If I didn't, the same thing would happen to Harry that happened to Neville and I'd be making the same mistake she had. Severus lurched. Granger. Come here, he said, firmly. The girl rose, like an automaton. Her face was completely smooth, free of worry, fear or anxiety. She stood in front of him. Fortunately, he was tall enough that he could do this without having to stand. He lit his wand, shining the light in her eyes, noting with some apprehension that her pupils only reacted sluggishly. Severus remembered that Granger had been breathing for the girl, without any protection, into the girl's mouth. It was not unusual for a victim to vomit during CPR. God only knew what ingesting a partially digested, potentially lethal potion would do. Severus gulped down the coffee he still held in one hand. He grated, earning shocked looks from all of them, except Granger, who just looked at him with detached interest. Why had he fallen asleep? Poppy was out of it too. No one else realized. But, didn't they see it? Lloyd's eyes were red and she was shaking with reaction. The boys were sitting or standing around, trying to pretend that they weren't on the verge of weeping, as well. 13-year-old girls, who had just given a CL mate CPR, should not be this composed. There were several antidotes to peace. But it wasn't going to be pretty when he gave one to her. Not after this evening. Damn it. Dumbledore, snapped Severus, Miss Granger needs attention. Get one of those healers in here. Professor Dumbledore, Granger asked in a small voice, I was wondering, could my mum come to visit? Severus started nodding. Headmaster, if she's asking for her mum right now, I suggest you send someone to apparate down there and retrieve Drive. Granger, that would actually be ideal, if they could get Granger's mother here, for the inevitable hysteria. Severus waved his wand, doing a few diagnostic spells. The child seemed stable enough. He could turn her over to one of the healers, in good conscience. Dumbledore nodded sharply, turned and called for one of the healers. A woman in green robes came hurrying over. Severus says Miss Granger needs attention, said Dumbledore. While helping revive Miss Weasley, she ingested some of the potion, said Severus. Oh, my, how much? The healer drew out her wand and began running diagnostic spells while the boys began muttering to each other in alarm. Miss Lloyd was now actually crying on one of the twins' shoulders. "Not a dangerous amount, but I believe it should be counteracted," said Severus, "otherwise she might be weeks sleeping it off. And the longer we leave it, the worse it will be, when she comes off of it." The healer nodded. "I see what you mean," she said, reading the numbers. The diagnostic charm was returning. "The child made a damned strong concoction. I suggest you wait until Granger's parents arrive, however," Severus suggested. The healer looked around and nodded, resigned. She took Granger by the shoulders. "You just come along with me, dear," she said. "Thank you, Severus," breathed Dumbledore. "I hesitate to ask more of you." "But you will," Severus snarled. He summoned a quill from a nearby table and transfigured it into a cane for balance. If he was going to need a walking stick for any length of time, he was going to have to get himself a properly ominous-looking one, he thought, distractedly. Lucius S. topped one was rather nice. At least it prevented Potter from jumping up and trying to help him, this time. Severus was aware, the headmaster would probably prefer to do this himself. Unfortunately, since it involved potions, he might not understand what he was seeing. It was one thing to legilimen's a mind, another to interpret the impressions. If they happened to look at how Miss Weasley made the potion, for instance, if Miss Weasley used an ingredient unfamiliar to Dumbledore, it would be difficult for him to know if Miss Weasley had properly identified the thing. Dumbledore also had no medical training. It was an entire specialized CL that some healers took, those that had a talent and interest in legilimency, on the medical uses of the art. A weakened or shocked mind could destroyed, by a mind as powerful as Dumbledore's, if he made a mistake. Then there was the advanced occlumency that Severus had taken. Only a few healers or aurors took that course of study. It allowed one to enter the mind of the mad or the dying without being caught up in it. Severus actually had no idea if Dumbledore had that skill. It was rare as Animagi. Severus hobbled around the screen, nodding at Pomona and the other healer. Pomona drew him up a chair at the bedside. He sat down in it gratefully, placing his stick upright between them and putting both hands on top of it. Pomona and the healer stepped back to the head of the bed, where Miss Weasley couldn't see them, but they could see her and witness the questioning. Miss Weasley's color was much better and her eyes were open to slits. The spell that was breathing for her glowed blue around her mouth and nose. A few different monitoring spells were registering her blood pressure, magical activity, and such, on the parchment on the bedside table. "Well, Miss Weasley," Severus said, coolly, as though he were there to discuss an inadequate potions essay, "you seem to have caused quite a bit of turmoil tonight, with your actions. I wonder if, perhaps, that was your plan." He kept his voice carefully neutral, not wanting to frighten her, but he did not soften it too much, either. Nothing would frighten the child so much as too great a change in his manner. So, he spoke to her as he would speak to one of his Slytherin first years that he had caught weeping in the dormitories, late at night. Her eyes widened as she grunted. He held up his hand quickly. "You'll find you can't speak. There is a spell that is supporting your breathing. The muscles of your respiration will not work for another day or two." Tears started to slip slowly down the girl's cheeks. Severus knew she wouldn't be able to lift a hand to wipe them, so he took out a handkerchief, did it for her. Unable to cringe or turn her face away, her pupils constricted in fear. Severus sighed and pushed what had to be an itchy piece of hair out of her face. "The paralysis is temporary, I assure you. If this had been an accidental poisoning, Severus would have told her how lucky she'd been that Granger and Lloyd had known what to do. Now, so we that have some method of communication, I would like you to blink once for yes, and twice for no. Do you understand? One slow eye blink." Severus nodded. "Miss Weasley, we would rather like to know how this happened. Since you will not be able to talk, I am going to enter your mind. It is a spell that might cause you some discomfort. There will be more, if you fight me. Do you understand?" 2 rapid eye blinks. 2 more rapid eye blinks. 2 more rapid eye blinks. The child's face went very white. The ink, in the automatically recording quill, marked her blood pressure in red, rather than black, to show a sudden, ominous change. "Professor Snape," the healer said, sharply. "Please, calm yourself," Severus said, quietly to the girl. "I take it you do understand, but you wish to withhold consent." One eye blink. Severus sat for a few minutes, not saying anything until the recording quill's ink turned to black. He sighed. Please don't mistake this for a request, Miss Weasley, he said very softly, when he spoke again. Her eyes had closed, but he knew she hadn't fallen asleep. Her eyes opened, but before she could work herself into a state, he went on, keeping his voice level and soothing. Your parents will be here, soon. We aren't sure whether they should be allowed to see you, or not. We don't know if any of your brothers, Miss Granger or Mr. Potter should be allowed to see you. Or frankly, whether we should send you to the locked ward at St. Mungo's. Pomona came forward. Ginny, Professor Snape's done this before, you know. It's uncomfortable, but it won't hurt. A long pause as the girl's eyes moved from Pomona's face to Severus and back. Finally, one tired eye blinked. Pomona moved back, out of the way. Severus leaned forward to place his hand on one of Miss Weasley's, feeling that she probably needed the reassurance. He looked into her eyes, Legilimens. The girl's mind was a more of pain and guilt, but thankfully, it was not the disjointed nonsense of delusion. What kind of idiot falls for that? She was crying on someone's shoulder. I hurt people. I nearly killed people. They were sitting in the darkness of an unused CL room. She and a boy. It was hard to see who. Ginny, it's okay. Nobody blames you. That was Longbottom's voice. But, they should. They do. How can normal people even stand to be around me? Look, Ginny, everyone's got stuff they can't talk about. The scene changed. She and Longbottom were walking around the lake. Can't ever get the wand stuff right. Think this wand doesn't like me. Anyway, my hand shakes. I don't know why. Longbottom was saying, with a shrug. I can help you. She said, if I do you think we can make it? It's all botanical. Yeah, I'm really good with botanicals. It'd be better than dreamless sleep. If you take dreamless too often, you go crazy. Peace just calms you down. Oh God, Neville, that'd be great. I can't sleep and I keep seeing, the child shuddered, him. Around every corner. I don't know what to do. It's like I can feel him, with his hands on me. I think I'm losing my mind. No, you just have bad dreams. Sometimes, I even have them in the daytime too. It happens. Another jump. Diagon Alley, a summer's day, a chance encounter. Mum. Can I go get some ice cream with Neville? Molly Weasley smiled fondly at her daughter. Go on, then, love, I'll find you there, when I get done shopping. Oh, Merlin, Neville. What happened? She gasped. Neville sat down stiffly, not sitting back against the chair, a black bruise visible on his wrist. Gran's been gone for the summer, he said by way of explanation. She stood up. I have to tell Mum. She'll do something about it. Neville reached out and grabbed Ginny's hand. No. Ginny, don't. It'd kill Gran. Look, school starts in 3 days, right? It's fine. Don't worry. About a dozen boys showing up, effectively ended that conversation. The next image was Neville, lying pale and cold with Lupin crouched over him. Then, there were no more coherent scenes, just a whirl of self-loathing and anger and pain. Always destined to trust the wrong people, to make the wrong choices. The knowledge that she was responsible for her best friend's death. Knowing that she was unfit for decent human company. She replied to her mother's worried owls with artificial cheer, not wanting the poor woman to realize she'd spawned such a tainted, corrupt creature. She had ruminated constantly, after Neville's death, on the Dark Lord. The Dark Lord had whispered terrible things into the girl's mind. Things that would have surprised no one, if they had only stopped to think of it. Things that would not even normally be out of place, in such a mind, but magnified and twisted. She tried to scrub the creeping sensation of the memory of the Dark Lord's touch from her flesh, then she tried to cut it away. Nothing worked. The pain didn't stop. The pain would never stop. Severus' carefully wrought occlumency shield slipped. For a moment, he was no longer Professor Severus Snape, potions master. For one endless second he was merely Sev, who had utterly failed to protect his best friend, and had nothing in the world left to live for. His eyes slipped away and the spell fell. Reality reared itself. Tears and snot were mixing on his face and he wiped his face with Digest, blowing his nose before turning back to Miss Weasley. The healer and Pomona had tactfully found something to do, behind the head of the bed, that seemed to occupy them, without taking them out of sight or earshot. Miss Weasley's face was also a mess. Severus very carefully wiped her up. "I'm very sorry for your loss," he said, in a low voice. He reached down and pushed back the arm of her robe. He turned the arm over. There were little sideways cuts, running all up and down the arm. All in different stages of healing. Some as recent as yesterday. He shook his head, sighed. He'd seen this sort of thing before. They were very superficial. He gave his wand a quick wave, summoning one of Poppy's ever-present dittany salves to his hand. Without a word, he dabbed it all over the cuts and lay the arm back on the bed. Miss Weasley's eyes looked very confused. He indulged himself in a tired smirk. "Are there others?" 2 slow blinks. Good. He didn't fancy playing 20 questions. The unmistakable odor of bodily fluids filled the room. Miss Weasley's eyes dilated, then constricted, in horror, as she realized that the odor was from her. Severus raised an eyebrow. "If your respiratory muscles are not working," he said, recovering his dry tone, "you can hardly expect other muscles to work." He softened again, as she reddened, with shame. "Professor Sprout," called Severus, not moving from his chair, realizing the girl didn't know where Pomona and the healer were. "Miss Weasley, and I could do with some help." Pomona looked up sharply, as did the healer. Pomona bustled over, and then gave an understanding "ah." She levitated the child off the bed. Severus muttered a cleaning spell, doing clothes, sheets and blankets at once, wishing that shit was the worst thing he'd had to clean up tonight. Pomona laid her gently back down on the now clean, dry sheets, not to worry. In a minute, she told Miss Weasley, "The healer will do some spells, so that doesn't happen again, all right?" 1 slow blink. "Miss Weasley?" Severus asked. He waited for her to focus on him. "Would you like to see your mother?" 1 blink. Open, pleading eyes, with huge pupils and tears. More snot, which Severus leaned forward to wipe. "I'll go see if she's here yet, shall I?" Leaning heavily on his stick, Severus stood. The healer followed him out, so it would be all right for the girl to see her mother. She asked, anxiously. "I believe it would be beneficial, in fact," replied Severus. "It appears the child was distraught over the Longbottom death. The boy was her best friend, you see. Ah, and the young are always dramatic. I imagine she had no idea how lethal her cry for help could be. Or how upsetting people would find it. She said archly, 'Thank you. I'll see to finding her mother.' Be kind to her," cautioned Severus, suddenly wary of how some wizards regarded attempted suicides. He wasn't going to have a paralyzed girl subjected to some healer's misplaced disdain. Damned 19th century morals. It was a draught of peace, not a restricted potion. Don't jump to conclusions. She was trying to UAGE her grief, not join the boy. "So, you believe it was accidental," the healer said. "It's a complex potion." Shrugged Severus. "I have her in my 2nd year, she's an average student." "Oh, of course." Suddenly all sympathy again, damn her. He headed to the nearest bed, collapsing onto it. Dumbledore could wait till the bloody morning, to get his report. As he had so often done at the Dursleys, Harry was busy pretending he didn't exist. He'd tucked himself onto one of the window seats, near where the healers had taken Ginny, feeling cold and sick and alone. The Weasley brothers were still huddled at the other end, sitting on the living room suite that had been conjured, talking in whispers. He didn't think they noticed whether he was there, or not. He felt awkward, intruding on the family crisis. Marion was sitting between Fred and George. Hermione had been taken behind another screen, by one of the healers. Harry hoped she'd be okay. Snape hadn't seemed that concerned, but it was hard to tell. He had told Dumbledore to go get Hermione's mum, though. Whatever Snape, Pomfrey and McGonagall had done, it had taken a great deal out of them. When they'd been bringing Ginny up, Snape had stopped in the corridor, just outside the hospital wing, as if he could go no further. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. Most alarmingly, his knees had buckled and he'd started to slide down the wall. Harry had been the only one close enough to catch him. Dumbledore had quickly conjured a chair underneath him. Snape stayed awake long enough to drink a cup of the thick black coffee Professor Sprout was giving out, then seemed to pee out. Harry had picked up the remains of the coffee, before they could spill, and threw a blanket over the man. Madame Pomfrey wasn't any better off. She'd stayed awake long enough to talk to the healers and fell asleep mid-sentence. Percy caught her as she fell, setting her limp form on a bed, next to McGonagall. Harry dragged a chair out into the hall, taking his tea out there. He wasn't sure why he took it upon himself to keep an eye on Snape. It just seemed like someone should. Harry was surprised when Snape had woken up again. Rather than merely moving himself to a more comfortable place to sleep, he'd gotten up to see what he could do to help. Grudgingly, Harry had to admit, he admired Snape. The man had leaned so heavily on him, Harry was convinced he wouldn't make it to the chair. The way he had so quickly realized something was wrong with Hermione, when none of the rest of them had even started to notice, was astonishing. However, Harry had to wonder why Dumbledore didn't talk to Ginny himself. Surely, if she were that ill and upset, Snape would be the last one who could get her to talk. It was weird and a little scary, to watch the graceful Snape stagger, with palsied steps, across the room like an elderly muggle, with the help of a cane. It was then that Harry had left the Weasleys to sit down against the window. No one noticed him leave. It was quite a few minutes before Professor Snape stumbled out from behind the screen, where the healers were treating Ginny. He said something to the one who followed him out, in a low voice, about letting her see her mother. He also told the healer to be kind to Ginny. Harry wondered if someone should check the temperature in hell. Then, it hit him like a bucket of ice water. Ginny was going to die, after all. Dumbledore had hurried up the length of the hospital wing, starting to speak to Snape, but the man fell, face first, onto the nearest bed. The healer merely shook her head at Dumbledore. "It'll have to wait, Professor," she said. "When Mrs. Weasley gets here, send her in." She said more to the headmaster, but her back was angled away from Harry, so he missed the rest. Dumbledore was facing more toward Harry. Harry was pretty sure that Dumbledore knew he was there. The old wizard breathed a huge sigh of relief. Of course, Dumbledore's face lost some of its worry lines as he spoke to the healer. If Dumbledore was looking relieved, that meant that Ginny wasn't going to die. So, they were back to ice skating parties in hell. The healer turned around and went back behind the screen. To Harry's consternation, Dumbledore started walking over to him. Harry hadn't had a conversation with Dumbledore since his guardianship was transferred, and he did not want to have one now. As the headmaster was about to say something, the low embers of the fireplace flared to life, with bright green flames. Dumbledore turned away from Harry and hurried to the fireplace. Molly Weasley stepped out of the fireplace, wearing her dressing gown under her cloak. The Weasley brothers sprang to their feet, crowding around her. They spoke, voices tense, and uncharacteristically quiet, as her eyes swept over them. She hushed them. "Your father's right behind me," she told them quietly, in apparent answer to their questions. "He wants to firecall Bill, before he leaves." They nodded. "Where's Poppy, Albus?" Mrs. Weasley's voice was restrained, as she walked forward, through the crowd of her sons. The hair on the back of Harry's neck stood up. If Snape asking someone to be kind was weird, Mrs. Weasley being restrained was terrifying. "She is indisposed," Dumbledore said. "We have 2 of the healers from St. Mungo's here. And Pomona's with Ginny, as well. You'll want to talk to them first." Through gritted teeth, Mrs. Weasley said, "I want to see my daughter, Albus. Right now." "Of course, Molly, of course." Dumbledore went forward to take her arm. She snatched it out of his hand. From where he sat, Harry could see Dumbledore's face, sad and worried. Mrs. Weasley's mouth drawn into a harsh frown. Dumbledore dropped his hand slowly. "However, there are a few things you need to understand before you see her," he said, kindly. "I'm sure the healer can inform me," snapped Mrs. Weasley, losing patience. "Where is she?" Dumbledore indicated the screen. Mrs. Weasley hastened down to it. The healer from St. Mungo's must have heard her. Maybe she'd set an alarm spell. She came out to see Mrs. Weasley. "Are you Ginny's mother?" she asked. Mrs. Weasley nodded sharply. "I'd like to see her now," she said firmly. The healer nodded. "I'm about to do some spells, but why don't you come and let her know you're here, before I do?" "Have they told you anything about her condition?" "Not yet," said Mrs. Weasley, anxiously. The healer sighed. "Well, come along, but please remember, this is all only temporary." The healer moved to take Mrs. Weasley's arm and speak to her softly. Mrs. Weasley let her. Harry couldn't hear anything else. other than a few gasps and exclamations of dismay from Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley went behind the screen. Harry heard her voice speaking gently, but he never heard the words. He'd nearly dozed off, with his head against the window, when he heard her emerge from behind the screen. She turned back to say, "Your father and I will be here when you wake up, darling. The healers just want you to have a sleep, while they do these spells all right." Ginny never answered her. Mrs. Weasley's eyes were dry as turned around, but the lines around her mouth trembled, as someone suppressing tears. Dumbledore hurried down to meet her. Mrs. Weasley stopped, almost in front of Harry. She rubbed her hands together as if she were cold. When Dumbledore came within speaking distance, she drew her wand so fast, that Harry thought she was going to hex the headmaster. He must have too. He dropped back half a step, with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Molly," he began quickly. She turned. "Silencio." She pointed her wand at the screen that hid Ginny. She turned back to Dumbledore. "Don't you talk to me, Albus Dumbledore." She cried. "Don't you speak. Not one word." Her voice was rising. "I told you." She shrieked, tears starting down her face. "I will never, ever forgive myself for listening to you. I have been telling you, for weeks. For weeks." She punctuated her words with pointed jabs of her wand. "But I know nothing. She drew herself up, pointing at her own with her free hand. "I am merely an overprotective mother." She spat. Dumbledore seemed to sag in on himself, with every word. Mrs. Weasley went on. "Pomona told me some very interesting things just now, about my daughter. Things that never reached my ears. Never mind, that I have been owling you daily. Never mind, that I have been owling Ginny 3 times a week. I told you, she wasn't right." The sentence ended on a sob. "Molly, Dumbledore tried to move forward again, as if to comfort her. "I told you, not one word. Don't even think about it." She snapped. She held her free hand, palm out between them. Although she was crying, it was clear that comfort was not what she wanted. "Don't you dare. My daughter is lying in there." She pointed with her wand. "Paralyzed. Do you hear me? Paralyzed." She screamed the word so that it echoed from the stone ceiling. Harry heard a collective noise of anguish from the boys at the end of the room. "For Merlin only knows how long. I will have my say. Against my better judgment, I have listened to you, about Ginny. I have listened to you, about that diary. Try to tell me, now, that dark objects don't leave traces. Just try. Don't tell me what happened last year doesn't have something to do with this. And then, those floating horrors, out there," she pointed to the window, "have already been responsible for 1 death. And you and the ministry allow them to stay there. Are you all mad? The children are all already depressed. What are you trying to do? Drive them all over the edge?" "Molly, the ministry," Albus began, placatingly. "Bollocks," she barked. "You and your chess games and your power plays. You cozy up when it suits you, and do as you please when it doesn't. I have had enough." "But," Sirius Black, Mrs. Weasley actually cackled. "Oh, yes." Her voice was high-pitched, almost hysterical. "Yes, I suppose I was quite worried about that. Until I found out that Harry had been half-killed by those bloody muggles you sent him to. Remember, Albus, I saw that report. Broken bones, malnutrition, head injuries, to say nothing of what I saw last summer." Harry didn't think Mrs. Weasley remembered the rest of them were there, so beside herself was she, about Ginny. He never wanted his invisibility cloak more in his life than at that moment. She put her wand hand on her hip, gestured wildly with the other. "Oh, but there again. I'm just an overprotective mother with no understanding of muggle culture. Perhaps it's just normal to lock your children up and feed them once a day, through a cat flap. And, of course, my sons." She gave Fred and George a glance, waving her hand towards them. "Well, they'd say anything to save themselves a bit of bother, wouldn't they? Tell me, Albus, when have they ever made up such a story to get out of trouble?" She didn't seem to want an answer, as she went on. "Never. That's when. It's always been. Fair cop, we're caught, moving on. So, why would they make that up? Tell me." She paused for breath, but Dumbledore made no attempt to speak, this time. Whether out of anger, shame, or some other reason, Harry couldn't tell. He looked terribly old, and tired. With all that's going on, I can well imagine Dementors floating around are doing Harry's well-being a load of good, as well. I've had some interesting words with Remus, while we're on the subject. It took Harry a moment to realize whom she was referring to, when she said, Remus. What had Professor Lupin been telling Mrs. Weasley? Mrs. Weasley took a few steps towards Dumbledore, until they were merely a few steps apart. She held her wand in her fist now, and gestured with it, pointing it at his, might wish to ask him the significance of a certain number of drawings and artifacts, in his possession. And, to see the photographs of a certain broom cupboard, she snarled. Harry was nearly sick, on the spot. Did Mrs. Weasley mean what Harry thought she meant? Mrs. Weasley took a deep breath, her voice trembled with the effort of getting herself under control. I am going to have a cup of tea, and wait for the healers to be done with my daughter. And you? She took a step forward. Well, not another step. Speak. One more step, to me. She finished with a deadly whisper, her eyes blazing, standing on her toes to get right up into the tall man's face. She smoothed her red hair back, over her shoulder. With great dignity, she put her wand away, pushed him out of her way and went to join her sons. She sat down next to Percy, who had returned to his seat on a settee someone had conjured. Ron shoved a cup of tea into her shaking hand. The fireplace flared again and Mr. Weasley stepped out. Mrs. Weasley gave him a venomous look and turned away. The boys looked between their parents. Mr. Weasley gave his sons a little nod toward their mother. Mr. Weasley hurried down to talk to Dumbledore. I take it your wife is not pleased with you either, Arthur, said Dumbledore, heavily. Mr. Weasley was very pale and his eyes were shadowed. No, he said shortly, apparently not wanting to spend time discussing it. Has she seen Ginny yet? Yes, the healers are with Ginny right now, said Dumbledore. Perhaps, you and I should withdraw to Poppy's office, for a few minutes, until you can see her. Mrs. Weasley seemed to be keeping one eye on her husband, even as she drank her tea. No, I'd better stay here, Mr. Weasley said, firmly. Dumbledore nodded. Well, it might be wise for me to withdraw. I'll just be in Poppy's office. Dumbledore walked out of the room and closed Madame Pomfrey's office door behind him, with a quiet snap. Now that Dumbledore was gone, Harry reckoned he could just slip out the door, back to Gryffindor Tower. The headmaster would have said, if he wanted any more information. He really was a bit of an intruder here, and the truth was, they wouldn't notice if he were gone. Before Harry could move, Mr. Weasley spotted him, sitting curled up, knees too, on the window seat. Mr. Weasley glanced at the little group around his wife, then sat down beside Harry. Hello, Harry. You all right, are you? He asked gently. Hi, Mr. Weasley. Harry said. I'm okay. He shrugged. Harry, what happened? We got a very confused story from Dumbledore's message. But he said it was a potions accident. That you and Ron went to get Professor Snape and Madame Pomfrey. Harry sighed, telling the story as best he could. So, what is it Hermione and Marion were doing? Mr. Weasley asked, when Harry described arriving at the common room with Snape. It's called CPR. I don't remember what the letters stand for. They do it on the television all the time, but I've never seen anyone do it for real, replied Harry. What's it for? Asked Mr. Weasley, seriously. Well, when somebody stops breathing, I think it's supposed to make them start again, said Harry, uncertainly. Hermione was breathing for her. She stopped breathing, whispered Mr. Weasley, and Hermione did a muggle thing to make her start again. Harry nodded solemnly. Mr. Weasley looked thunderstruck. I love muggles, he whispered, fervently. And then, Professor Snape and Madame Pomfrey and Professor McGonagall. They did something. Harry tried to remember what Pomfrey had called it. Madame Pomfrey called it tribu ovida. Anyway, they've been pretty out of it ever since. Mr. Weasley seemed to mutter the syllables Harry had given him in a few different ways. Do you mean tribu ovida? He asked finally. That sounds right. Harry nodded. Professor Snape, Madame Pomfrey and Professor McGonagall. Mr. Weasley was looking paler than ever. He seemed to be keeping himself under control, with an effort. Yeah, it was just Madame Pomfrey and Professor Snape first. Professor Snape said something about he was going to do it alone, but then Professor McGonagall. Mr. Weasley, said Harry in alarm. The man had burst into tears. Sorry, Harry, gasped Mr. Weasley, wiping his face, taking a deep breath. Mrs. Weasley must have heard him. She came hurrying down the room. Arthur, come have some tea, she said sharply. You can't do anything, working yourself into a state. You come along too, Harry. You'll catch your death. She stumbled over the word, sat there. Mr. Weasley put his hand around Harry's shoulders and urged him up, leaving it there until they were both sat by Mrs. Weasley, who handed each of them a cup of tea. Fred and George were sat on the floor now. Marion had gone to lay down on one of the beds. Percy and Ron were sitting in the two wing chairs. All of them were staring into their teacups. They looked up when Harry and Mr. Weasley sat down. Molly, did they tell you what happened yet? Mr. Weasley asked her. She shook her head. I was just getting my bearings. Mr. Weasley jerked his head at the sleeping figures of the two teachers and the Medi-Witch. Molly, they used Tribuo Vitae. Mrs. Weasley dropped her cup. What does that mean? Asked one of the boys, in a small voice. They all stared at Mrs. Weasley's frightened face. It means, said Mrs. Weasley softly, your sister was dead. But, magic can't bring back the dead, Percy said in a breathless whisper. Mrs. Weasley shook her head. No. I didn't mean. I don't mean all the way dead. I don't mean she was really gone. I don't know. Her magic was still there. Her was still alive. Her soul hadn't fled yet. It only works if her magic is still there. They gave a bit of their magic, their souls, to her. She glanced at the sleeping figures. They're going to feel pretty poorly, for a while. Ron nodded. That's what Snape said to Hermione. Harry was impressed that Ron had been paying attention. Harry had almost forgotten that Snape said that. They'll be better though? Asked Harry. Yes, of course, said Mr. Weasley. It's not a spell that's used very often. I'm glad they were able to complete the triad. Professor Snape told Madame Pomfrey he'd do it himself, if he had to, said Ron. Fred, George and Percy all nodded. I thought he was going to, said George, or maybe it was Fred. It was like he was all set to do an incantation before McGonagall said she could help. What would have happened? Asked Percy. I'm not sure, said Mrs. Weasley, pensively. She waved her wand and her cup returned to her hand. Excuse me. A woman with a thick ponytail, looking very out of place, dressed in jeans, a thick winter jacket and boots, was knocking on the open hospital wing door. I'm sorry, she said, nervously. Professor Flitwick said this was where I'd find Professor Dumbledore. They looked at her, a bit confused. Yes, of course. Percy, go tell Professor Dumbledore that someone's looking for him, said Mr. Weasley, tiredly. Before Percy could get up, the woman said, actually, I'm looking for Hermione. Professor Flitwick said there had been an accident and she was asking for me. Mr. Weasley jumped up. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Granger. He reached out to take her hand. It's been a long night. I didn't recognize you, for the minute. You'll have to forgive me. Please, come and sit down. Harry hastily made room for her. It's all right, actually, she said, a little primly. Another time, Harry might have smiled at the strong resemblance to Hermione. I don't look my best at the moment. She smiled a little crookedly. Professor Flitwick seems to have gotten called away rather hastily. I'm still not sure what's happened. Can somebody explain? Where's Hermione, boys? Asked Mrs. Weasley, softly. One of the healers took her over there, said Harry, pointing to the screen on the other side from where Ginny was. I'll go get the healer, shall I? Said Mr. Weasley, getting up. Mrs. Granger, said Mrs. Weasley, very seriously, from what I understand, your daughter helped save my daughter's life tonight. I'm sorry, asked Mrs. Granger. What was it she and Marion did? One of the twins asked Harry. It was some muggle thing. CPR, said Harry. Yeah, said Ron, hoarsely, but me and Harry, we wouldn't have even figured out that there was anything was wrong with Ginny until she'd keeled over if it wasn't for her. She'd already told me to go get Pomfrey before Ginny even hit the floor. Harry nodded. She told me to go fetch Snape. Told me it was a potion, before I even figured out what to think. But, what happened? Gasped Mrs. Granger. My daughter had a mishap with a potion. An overdose. Mrs. Weasley said softly, Hermione, whatever she did, she's one reason Ginny's still alive. Mrs. Granger leaned forward to place her hand on Mrs. Weasley's. Oh, I'm so sorry, she said softly, but, where's Hermione? The healer came forward with Mr. Weasley. Drive. Granger. Yes, she turned. I'm one of the healers from St. Mungo's. That's the wizarding hospital. I'm looking after your daughter at the moment. It seems that she ingested some of the potion Miss Weasley overdosed on. How? Demanded the woman, looking affronted. Well, Miss Weasley suffered an arrest and your daughter started CPR. Miss Weasley vomited. The potion is one that is absorbed fairly easily. Harry wondered if the healer was Muggle-born or Muggle-trained because she didn't seem to have a problem with the term, CPR. Is that dangerous? Mrs. Granger gasped, starting to her feet. Not enough to be dangerous, but, it's usually, an anti-anxiety type potion. When I give her an antidote, she's likely to have a strong reaction. We felt she'd do better if you were here, the healer replied, gently. Can I see her? The healer nodded. Yes, of course, right away. I'd like to give her the antidote, as soon as possible. The longer we wait, the more upset she'll be when she gets the antidote. The healer gestured, if you'll come this way. Mrs. Weasley clasped Mrs. Granger's hand before she went to Hermione. In a throaty voice she said, Thank you, Mrs. Granger. Molly, called Professor Sprout, why don't you and Arthur come see Ginny, now, for a few minutes? Mr. and Mrs. Weasley hurried down the long room. With all the adults gone, the boys just sat, staring into their cups of tea or into the fire, not speaking. They still didn't really understand what was wrong with Ginny. There was so little sound from behind either screen that they knew silencing charms had been used on both. A flash of silver light flew past them, through the door of Madame Pomfrey's office. A second later, Professor Dumbledore emerged, his wand in his hand, walking purposefully towards the little group. He stopped to take in the boys. Marion still slept on one of the beds as they stared at him. He seemed to be counting heads. The set of his shoulders relaxed, minutely, as his eyes fell on Harry. Mr. Weasley, he asked Ron, who was closest, where is your father? With Ginny, sir, said Ron. Dumbledore strode down there, had an apparently urgent word with Mr. Weasley, then he resumed his original path out of the hospital wing, stopping for a second to say, there's yet another crisis that calls me away. I need you all to remain here, until I return. As he left, he closed the door behind him and they heard the unmistakable sound of a locking spell being cast. The view from the astronomy tower was astonishing tonight. He could see the distant lights of Hogsmeade and the sky was moonless and clear. Somehow, Severus took solace in the fact that the last thing he'd ever see was something beautiful. He pointed his wand at his left wrist. Sectum Sempra. His wand clattered to the ground, as bright blue pain flashed up his arm and he clutched at it involuntarily. He fell to his knees, a gush spraying over his face and clothes. His spell was so much more efficient than a knife, cutting down through vein, tendon and ligament right to the artery. It won't be long, he thought, in time to his heartbeat. He curled up around his forearm on his knees, breathed through the hurting the way he did after his dad got finished with him. This time though, his magic wouldn't start clotting the blood or closing the cut. He'd created this spell himself, a jinx to prevent the recipient's magic from joining the tissues. It had started out as something of theoretical challenge. He'd created it and its counter just to see if he could, or so he told himself. Since his mother had gotten so sick and started drifting away from him, his thoughts had turned more and more to the practical application. What sort of future did he have? He was a half-blood bastard. The prince's relatives had never accepted his mother's marriage, with no name, no prospects, no money, no position. He'd be lucky if he could get a job as a dishwasher at the Leaky Cauldron. The pain was fading a bit. He recognized the first signs of shock. A little cold, his heart rate speeding up to compensate for the loss of blood. He smiled at himself, surprised that he remembered that much from the potions essay he did for Slughorn last week on remedies for splinching. He scooted over to the wall, leaning his back against it, staring idly at the growing pool of blood. So, for splinching, didn't he to close bleeding wounds? Skelegro for if a bone has been splinched or vanished completely. Comfrey to reattach muscle. For shock. Severus couldn't remember more. He turned his face upward. The stars overhead were very pretty. Severus. Mr. Snape. Two female voices called, sharply, Severus. I found your note. Lily was weeping as she spoke. What have you done? Severus found that a languorous tiredness prevented him from answering. He merely stared at them both, a little stupidly. Drink this. Madame Pomfrey held a vial to his lips and he swallowed. Good lad. She whispered. No one had called him a good lad since his mother had stopped speaking. Severus woke with a gasp, staring at the ceiling of the hospital wing. He almost expected to lift his head and see Lily sitting at his bedside. With that worried expression she'd had all those years ago. They'd been, what, third year, fourth. It was still very dark. He heard people moving around, speaking in hushed voices, but everyone he could see was sleeping. He shut his eyes again. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Severus' voice was almost pleading. They stood in the front room of his house on Spinner's End. A single candle on the table provided a pale, shivering pool of light. I wasn't supposed to have anything to do with it. And he's the bloody picture of Potter. I told you. Use 3 hairs. What did you do? Throw the man's hairbrush into the cauldron. Lily stood in front of the window with her arms crossed, looking out on the dark street. She wore simple white robes, her red hair unbound down her back. Severus could see her face in the window, as in a mirror. She smiled at him gently. In the reflection, I know, he looks like his daddy but he's just like his father, Sev, she said, quietly. Severus threw himself into his chair. Lily, please, you don't know what you're asking. I do, Sev, you're all he's got left. Her reflected face was very pale and serious. Lily started to turn around. Severus was unaccountably terrified of seeing her face, of meeting her eyes, unobstructed and unmediated. He leapt out of the chair, throwing his wand hand between them. He turned his face away, surprised to discover that he dished a sword rather than a wand. This time, Severus sat bolt upright, feeling like he wanted to be sick. He was trembling, like he used to after dreams of the Dark Lord. Are you all right? Molly Weasley sat in a rocking chair not too far away, knitting. Fine, thank you, Severus replied, hoarsely, with what he hoped was a dignified manner. Mrs. Weasley jumped up, coming back with a cold GL of water. If it had been anyone else, if it had been any other time, he would have snapped at her, told her to leave him be. However, he was aware of how much Mrs. Weasley was coping with, at the moment. If he was too tired to snap, that was pure coincidence. He grunted his thanks, draining the GL in one long swallow. The healers said you should eat, if you woke. Mrs. Weasley said. What time is it? He asked, ignoring her. 5:30, she replied. She put the water GL on a side table, and came back with a plate of scones. Do you want tea or coffee? She asked. Severus just gave in, and took the plate from Mrs. Weasley, settling on eating as the most expedient way to get her to leave him alone. Tea, if it's made, he replied, looking around. Most of the beds seemed to be occupied with sleeping people. Potter was sleeping in the one next to him. How is your daughter? Asked Severus, formally, accepting a cup of tea from her and handing back the now empty plate. He'd eaten everything on it, without tasting it. Mrs. Weasley sighed, as well as can be expected. The healers sent me out here, for a bit. They needed to do some more charms, so they said. It may be that they thought, if they sent me out here, I'd sleep. She snorted at the unlikeliness of that notion. They said I could go in again, in a few hours. Severus nodded. At least one of the charms they need to do is fairly intricate. It would require an hour or two, if they were going to be able to care for the child's body, until she regained muscle control. They needed a better way of feeding her than simply spelling potions into her stomach. They also couldn't just spell waste products out of her body. They'd run the risk of removing bits of her. Severus swung his legs over the side of the bed. After a moment he stood up, gingerly. "Do you need help, Professor?" asked Mrs. Weasley, solicitously. Severus shook his head. He grabbed his stick and began to stagger to the bathroom. Mrs. Weasley was at his arm, immediately. She never said a word, which was just as well. Severus wouldn't have had a civil thing to say to her. She steadied him as he hobbled on shaking legs, standing outside the bathroom waiting for him. He wanted nothing more than to drag himself back to his quarters, take an hour-long shower and crawl into his bed. Dumbledore could get one of his 7th years to supervise his cleas today, or else the old codger could teach them his damned self. "Professor Snape," Mrs. Weasley said softly as she led him back to his bed, "you should know. There was something of a disturbance in the castle last night. More than," she hesitated, "Ginny, that is." Severus felt the pressure against his ears, of a silencio. Mrs. Weasley must have just cast it around herself. Severus did not like her ominous tone. "Oh. It seems that Sirius Black broke into Gryffindor Tower," she said, grimly. It had not been often in Severus' life that he was struck speechless. He sat down on the bed, staring at Mrs. Weasley. She glanced at Potter's sleeping figure and pulled one of the infirmary's screens between his bed and Severus. "I think Harry would be dead, if he hadn't been here," she said, her voice the calm of someone who had already been frantic with fear, and had now run out of adrenaline. Seamus and Dean said that they had just gone to bed, after all the excitement, you know. "Well, Ron's been keeping the door locked because of Hermione's cat chasing his rat." Dean thought he heard someone cast an Alohomora. He thought it was Ron or Harry coming back, and they were being really quiet, so he didn't think anything of it. "Well then, whoever it was just kept moving around," Dean said. And then he realized whoever it was too skinny to be Ron and too tall to be Harry. And then he started tearing the dorm up. Mrs. Weasley shuddered. Both the boys said that he was pulling the beds apart, and he started yelling, "Where are you, you little bastard?" Severus felt for his wand, in the pocket of his robe. Did Black hurt anyone? "He didn't hurt any people," sighed Mrs. Weasley. Seamus and Dean said that Harry's dog showed up in the middle of everything, snapping and growling and barking. "I think that dog saved those boys' lives last night." She took something out of her pocket. The portraits say the dog seemed like it was chasing something, but they couldn't see what. "Chased it right out of Gryffindor Tower, down that dead-end corridor on the 3rd floor. Dumbledore's wondering if Black has an invisibility cloak. That wouldn't affect a dog so much. And then maybe Black used one of his old tricks. We're not exactly sure what he did. There's no portraits in that hallway. We haven't found the dog, but we found this." Mrs. Weasley held out a broken, blood-stained collar. "We haven't told him yet." Severus stared. Damn it. For some reason this turned his stomach, more than anything else in the last 24 hours. "Where's Dumbledore now?" "He went to have an hour," said Mrs. Weasley. "The Aurors are meeting with him at 8. There's talk of sending the children home, until the wards can be renewed on the castle." She glanced at the screen that hid her daughter. "I imagine the Prophet will want a statement from us. There'll be no keeping this quiet. And I'd rather tell them something than have them make something up." "In my opinion," Severus grated, "your daughter's actions can be laid directly at the feet of the Ministry, their recklessness, leaving the Dementors here. And now, we discover they can't even be trusted to keep Black out of the castle." Mrs. Weasley looked at Severus steadily. The healers believe she made a mistake with the potion and didn't mean to make it toxic. That she was merely trying to brew a draught of peace. She was distressed. "It was an easy mistake to make," replied Severus, shrugging. "Ginny has always been a good cook." Mrs. Weasley's eyes were sad, and her potion's marks were rather good last year, even with everything that happened. Severus sighed. "I don't think it would be to anyone's advantage to have your daughter painted as mentally unstable. Poppy knows several good mind healers who are both skilled and discreet. I would ask her for their names." "Thank you, Professor," Mrs. Weasley said softly, "for everything." He nodded, wishing fervently she'd go away now. He felt very uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Professor," Mrs. Weasley, "I've been wanting to tell you something. I know it's not a good time, but..." Severus controlled another sigh, with effort. "Yes. I thought you should know. When Arthur and I were first married, his mother told us that we shouldn't become too concerned if we were to have a dark-haired child. She wouldn't have said anything about it if Arthur hadn't married a redhead. Unconsciously, it seemed, Mrs. Weasley tugged on a trailing strand of her hair. She said, if we had a dark-haired child, we should just do a hair-coloring charm so people wouldn't talk. It was because of what she did, you see. Mrs. Weasley looked at Severus intently, as if to make sure he took her meaning. She was worried that the dark hair would come out in a grandchild. She didn't want me to be suspect. Mrs. Weasley smiled, a little crookedly. If there's anything we can do for you and Harry, just ask. Severus nodded, gravely. That would explain all the Weasley children. He decided it was time for a change of topic. Tell the headmaster, he can find me in my quarters. I'll want to talk to him about what to do about this latest. He paused. Development, he said harshly. Mrs. Weasley nodded, and insisted on helping him hobble to the flow. 2 hours, 3 pepper-ups and a long shower later, Severus was summoned to Dumbledore's office. Minerva and Poppy were there, looking similarly fragile and worn, along with Phyllis and Pomona. This meeting was to be with Minister Fudge and Shacklebolt to discuss the Black situation, the Dementor situation and God only knew what else. The heads of houses and Poppy were required, due to the Weasley girls' accident, to Severus' relief. The ministry was seizing on that explanation like a drowning man. Severus slumped in the squashy armchair the headmaster had conjured for him. Dumbledore rather proudly explained to the minister what Minerva, Poppy and himself had done for Miss Weasley and that they were still a bit under the weather. Minerva looked at Dumbledore sourly, but took the proffered chair. Severus noted there was none of their usual banter. Minerva must be furious. Poppy was beyond furious. Severus had been on the receiving end of her rants about the Dementors every time she had to ask him to brew her extra calming potions of various kinds. Severus' mind was wandering, almost idly. Severus wondered if anyone had told Potter that Black had killed his dog yet. Severus refused to be the bearer of that little bit of bad news. He really wasn't hearing whatever Fudge was yammering on about. He only tuned into the conversation when he heard the minister say in a rather supercilious tone, well, it's understandable if certain students are a bit fragile. I mean, little girl like that, bound to be prone to nightmares. She was friends with Longbottom, after all. Poor soul, but you can't generalize from her that the rest of the students are, in any way, affected. Minister, I'm telling you, those creatures are wreaking havoc here after the Longbottom death. Perhaps, if it had never happened, we wouldn't be having these problems. Poppy tapped her finger on the arm of her chair as she spoke, but I tell you, they're feeding off the general distress of the place. I have first years, in tears, in my office, every single day. She finished. Oh, come now, is that so unusual, in first years? I expect they're all Muggleborns, are they? The minister replied, in a patronizing tone. You know, Severus said, lazily, rousing himself a bit, I'll have to ask Lucius if Draco's ever been prone to nightmares before. Poor boy's been getting no sleep. Lucius, asked the minister. Malfoy. Said Severus, his son's in my house. Terrible nightmares this year, I'm afraid. Affecting his marks. And he's been getting quite thin. Pomona started nodding. You know, now that you mention it, one of mine went to see Poppy the other day because she hasn't been sleeping. Just went to pieces in your CL didn't she, Severus? She said, conversationally. Yes, Susan Bones, wasn't it? Replied Severus, contemplatively. Generally, she's so level-headed. She couldn't tell me why either. She just said she couldn't stop thinking about. Severus paused for effect, terrible things. Yes, I sent her to Poppy for some chocolate and a dreamless sleep. Phileas jumped in. I've had to write to Davy's father. He's been very concerned about the letters he's been getting from the boy. Very concerned. For the next few minutes the heads of houses discussed the students who had been reporting nightmares, insomnia, anxiety and depression. All purebloods. All with influential parents. Fudge's eyes became wider and he began to sweat. But, without the Dementors, how will we catch Black? Whispered Fudge. That's not our problem. Snapped Minerva, our problem is protecting this school. And, clearly, Dementors are unable to do it. My suggestion is that we renew the wards on Hogwarts. Although, what the Board of Governors will want to do after this latest. Severus didn't fail to notice that, Though he said nothing, Kingsley Shacklebolt sat through this conversation with the slightest of smiles playing at the corners of his mouth. Dumbledore sighed. They have already contacted me. Apparently, some of the students contacted their parents about the excitement, early this morning. They're holding an emergency meeting, at noon. Several of them have spoken to me of a temporary closure, to do just what you suggest. After the attacks last year, the Longbottom affair, now Miss Weasley and Black breaking into the castle, they feel that the wards, do indeed, need renewing. Severus rubbed his eyes, letting himself tune out the conversation. He leaned his head back in his chair, trying to decide what to do about Potter. He remembered Lily's eyes from his dreams last night. What she had said to him. Really, there was only one decision. Dimly, he heard Fudge taking his leave. He didn't bother to open his eyes to see him go. Severus, Dumbledore said, with concern, are you all right? They were the only ones left in the office. Severus must have fallen asleep. He hadn't even heard the others leave. He shook his head, trying to clear it. No, I'm not bloody. All right, he growled. How the hell did Black get in here? He stood up. He'd be less likely to fall asleep if he stood. Plus, this was the type of conversation he preferred to have standing. Unfortunately, any advantage his height might give him in a confrontation was lost with him still needing to lean heavily on a cane for support. Not that his height ever helped when he dealt with Dumbledore. I don't know, Dumbledore said, simply, looking up at him. It is even more troubling that he did so last night, when almost all of Hogwarts' chief defenders were tied up in another emergency. One of the requirements for each of the heads of house was to be a wizard powerful enough to hold the school against attack, if need be. Where was Lupin last night, anyway? Snapped Severus, too tired to even attempt tact. He wanted to pace, but staggering back and forth would be entirely too undignified. Are we sure he wasn't helping his old friend? Dumbledore looked at Severus, the set of his face not changing but his voice becoming a little arch. It was the full moon last night. Remus was locked in his office. I set the wards myself and unlocked them half an hour ago. He was still asleep when I checked on him, so I haven't even informed him, yet. Dumbledore held Severus' eyes, until the younger man finally looked away. Have you had anything to eat? Asked Dumbledore, in a softer tone. Poppy said the three of you would be quite tired, for some time yet. I'm fine, muttered Severus. Molly Weasley makes it her mission in life to feed anyone who crosses her path. Dumbledore smiled. She does, doesn't she? Then his face saddened. I'm afraid I'm not in her good books, at the moment. Can't imagine why. Dumbledore's eyes were hurt. This has been a very bad term. Severus straightened up, facing Dumbledore's desk directly. He placed both hands on his cane. Headmaster, I'd like to officially request a few weeks' leave. Especially, if the governors are planning to close to renew the wards. Severus said. Dumbledore nodded. Sagely, yes, of course, Severus. Poppy did say that the lion's share of the magic for Miss Weasley came from you. She'd actually suggested both you and Minerva take at least 2 weeks off. Were you planning to stay here, or perhaps you'd be better resting at home? Although, it does seem that the castle is likely to be empty, resetting wards can be a noisy process. I intend to go to Spinner's End, replied Severus. In that case, we must decide what we're going to do with Harry and then. Decide? Severus asked, as though he were surprised. What is there to decide? I'm taking Potter with me, he said, before he could rethink it. I beg your pardon, asked Dumbledore, his eyebrows going up. It wasn't often Severus had ever seen the headmaster wrong-footed. Whether or not the board chooses to close the school until the wards are renewed, I'm taking Potter away. We've already seen that Gryffindor Tower's not safe, Severus said in a rush. Dear God, what was he thinking? He was out of his mind. I'm in no fit condition to teach, probably for a week or two at least, regardless. No one need know that Potter is with me. Even so, there are only 2 people in the wizarding world who have ever known where my home is. One of them is dead. Severus, my thought was. Dumbledore began. I don't care what you thought, snapped Severus. This is not your decision. There is nowhere else. He cannot stay here. You and Minerva will be too concerned with other matters to keep a watch on the boy. The Weasleys have other problems. The Dursleys should never have been an option even 12 years ago, clearly. Don't even try to tell me that Lupin is on the list." His voice was rising in volume. He held up a hand to forestall Dumbledore, when he looked as though he might speak, "and it is not your decision. I will not have you interfering in this. The boy is nearly unreachable. Have you noticed? He doesn't sleep. He barely speaks. He only eats because I threaten him. Tell me, how did he react to the news that Black killed his familiar?" "He was very stoic about it," said Dumbledore, with a hint of pride. "And that's normal in a 13-year-old, is it?" demanded Severus, exasperated. "Do you want him to be the next one to brew himself a lethal potion?" "Severus, I think you exaggerate." Dumbledore waved his hand, a little too airily for Severus' comfort. "The boy's a Gryffindor, they don't tend toward such cowardly gestures." Severus supplied, sarcastically, "Tell that to Ginny Weasley," he finished, coldly. That got Dumbledore's attention, but the healers said it was an accident. He stared at Severus with narrowed eyes. "I lied." Severus sat down again, feeling his legs tremble beneath him. "That child has an illicit lab somewhere. In it, you will find, not just the ingredients for the peace draft, but distilling equipment to reduce it. She finished it last night, under the moon, using the process intended for self-deliverance from a terminal illness." "But, why?" sputtered Dumbledore. Severus considered Dumbledore. "For a long moment, from what I could gather, the girl blames herself for Longbottom's death." "All right," conceded the headmaster, "but we were discussing Harry. Why would he be in as much distress, as you appear to believe?" "Oh, I don't know, Dumbledore," sneered Severus. "Perhaps a lifetime of neglect might make one a trifle tightly wound. Perhaps a term where a schoolmate dies in an incident that closely mirrors one's own circumstance might be a slight bit unpleasant. Perhaps, when all one's careful defenses come crashing down around one's ears, it can be a little upsetting." Severus said in his low deadly voice. "Who are we speaking of here, Severus? Harry, or yourself?" Dumbledore asked, softly. Severus did not dignify that with an answer. It would not do to lose his job through swearing at the man. They both looked at each other steadily. This time, Dumbledore was the first to look away. The headmaster stood to look out of his window, so, taking him away from his friends is the answer?" challenged Dumbledore, clearly looking for an objection. Yes, that was a problem, but Severus couldn't think of any better answer. He needs to get away from those damn Dementors, first off. At least at Spinner's End, he'll be safe from both Black and Dementors. And then, maybe, Lily would stop looking at Severus with those damned accusing eyes in his dreams every night. Perhaps Minerva. "Aren't you listening?" growled Severus. "The boy is not a chess piece to move as you see fit. He is not yours at all. If your goal is to maintain influence over the child, to be perfectly honest, Minerva is no happier with you than I am. Severus, I just cannot imagine that you, with your history with the child." Dumbledore turned to gaze at Severus with mournful reproach. "Oh, for God's sake, Dumbledore, I can hardly do worse than Petunia." Severus struggled to his feet, and, as I have said before, legally speaking. He emphasized the word, legally. "You have no say in this. You can, of course, deny me leave. Even sack me, if you like. But I am taking my child, and going home. Today." Panic. Adults bustling about the hospital wing woke Harry the next morning, long before he generally got up for CL. Someone had brought up breakfast for everybody and set up a table where the settee and chairs had been the night before. However, before Harry could even think about breakfast, a grave-looking Dumbledore had taken Harry aside, to break the news that Snuffles had gone missing. "Well, the headmaster said the dog had disappeared after chasing Sirius Black out of Gryffindor. Anyway, I'm afraid he's gone for good," were the headmaster's exact words. Harry stared at him, not knowing how to respond. "Harry," asked Dumbledore, quietly, "are you all right?" In the end, Harry just nodded. It was just a dog, after all. No point in getting upset, not really. His eyes prickled, but there were much bigger things to worry about. Anyway, Snuffles was bound to turn back up, he always had before. The headmaster patted Harry on the shoulder. "There's a way, lad," he said, in an approving voice. The rest of the morning seemed to pee in a numb haze. Everyone seemed to be terribly interested in Sirius Black breaking into the castle. Somehow, Harry just couldn't feel that excited about it. He was glad that Dean and Seamus were safe, but honestly, otherwise Harry was more worried about Snuffles. Harry managed a few bites of the toast that someone, maybe McGonagall, put in front of him. It was hard to eat around the heaviness in his. Mrs. Weasley came out to tell them that they could see Ginny for a few minutes. She can't move, mind, but that'll Mrs. Weasley said. She can hear you, and the healers say she's not in any pain. We just have to look after her, till she's better. You can't stay long, because she'll get tired. It was a bit like talking to Hermione last year, when she'd been petrified, except that Ginny's eyes were alive and they could see she was hurting behind them. Harry was selfishly glad that the healers wouldn't let them stay more than about 5 minutes. Perhaps tomorrow he'd be better able to cope. Today, all he could manage was sitting at the side of her bed and giving her hand a quick squeeze. In some ways, he was the best off of the lot. Hermione was trying very hard not to cry and Ron couldn't seem to get near the bed. Mrs. Weasley sat on the other side of the bed, brushing Ginny's hair. Mrs. Weasley was talking, but she didn't seem to expect anyone to answer her. Nonetheless, it was terribly awkward. As they left her, McGonagall cornered Harry. Before he could leave, Harry. I need a word, she said tiredly. Harry stopped, arranging his face into what he hoped was a politely expectant expression. He really just wished she'd go away and leave him alone. He was tired and just wanted to go back to bed. Failing that, he wanted to get to a CL where he could pretend to be taking notes so no one would bother him. She started speaking, but he really didn't take it in. He was following her correctly. She told him that Snape was taking him home. She nattered on, at length, about how the Board of Governors were planning on closing the school to renew the wards, that Harry needed to go somewhere safe, that no one else wanted him and Snape was stuck with him. Perhaps those weren't her exact words, but that was what she meant. She said something about being sorry that his familiar had died. Where had she gotten that idea? People seemed to be saying a lot of things this morning that he wasn't quite able to catch. It didn't matter. All was as Harry had predicted. If Harry could summon enough energy, he might be angry. Harry hurried to catch up to Ron and Hermione, who were headed back to Gryffindor Tower. It's all right, Ron said, as soon as Harry told him what McGonagall had said. When Ginny's a bit better, my parents'll want to have you at the Burrow. Harry smiled, but he knew Ron was being overly optimistic. Harry's luck just didn't run that way. Ginny looked like she could take months to get better. Harry would only be in the way. I'll send you a letter, if you send Hedwig to find me, said Hermione, chingly. I'm leaving this morning too. My mum wants me to pack up some things. She wants to take me home as soon as she can. She gave them both a quick hug and scampered up the stairs to the girls' dorms. Harry didn't even had time to pack. McGonagall told him someone was doing it for him and Snape was having everything sent. She told him Snape said just to put a few things he'd need for today into a bag. She also mentioned that Snape said he should dress for Muggle London. So, he threw on a pair of jeans, a sweater and trainers. Fortunately, these items had been among the extra clothing Snape had seen fit to buy him when they went to Hogsmeade, complaining that he wouldn't have Harry slouching around in clothes fit for Filch's rag bag on weekends. Harry hesitated over his invisibility cloak, then tucked it into his book bag. He threw on his winter cloak, not having anything else for the cold. He met Snape in the entrance hall, with Hedwig in her cage, but Snape said, I think your owl will not be comfortable with the transportation we intend to use. Harry's heart dropped. We'll have to leave her here, sir? He asked, dully. Bad enough that they hadn't found Snuffles yet, but now he'd have to leave Hedwig behind. Snape shook his head. He snapped open Hedwig's cage, holding out his arm. With remarkable docility, she climbed up onto it. The older wizard brought her up close to his face and whispered in her ear. She nipped at his fingers affectionately, as if she actually liked the man. Curiously, something like a smile tugged at one corner of Snape's mouth. After a moment, Hedwig jumped to Harry's shoulder to tug on a bit of Harry's hair, then took off out of the open front door of the castle. Sir? Asked Harry, in surprise. The only person, other than Harry, that Hedwig was so friendly with was Hagrid. She'll meet us there, said Snape, simply. Oh, before I forget. He drew his wand pointing it at Harry. Hold still a moment, Potter. In his other hand Snape held an old-fashioned fob watch. Harry felt a tingle of magic move over and through him. After a moment, Snape nodded sharply, snapped the cover of the watch shut and tucked it away in the pocket of his blazer. "Let me have your cloak." Harry took it off and held it out. "I have no idea what Muggle teenagers are wearing these days, so you'll have to make do." Snape sniffed, tapping it with his wand. The cloak transfigured into a black winter jacket. "I realize it's not precisely fashionable, but where we're going, it's best not to draw attention. It keeps the charms of your cloak." Snape handed it back. "Come along, then," he said, putting his wand away. He retrieved his cane from where it was leaning against the wall. Harry nodded, and followed the man as he made his slow way out to a waiting carriage. Since Dumbledore had broken the news to him about Snuffles disappearing this morning, Harry had felt as though a thick blanket of fuzz had wrapped around his inn. Nothing seemed very important, not even the knowledge that Snape was taking him away from Hogwarts. He wasn't even curious about where they were going. A smattering of other students were also waiting for the train. The official word hadn't come down yet, but many parents were already calling their children home. It felt surreal to be standing on the platform, waiting for the Hogwarts Express, in a cold, late October drizzle. Not even Harry's charmed jacket kept out the chill. Professor Snape stood beside Harry, not speaking. If he noticed Harry's discomfort, he gave no sign. Harry was vaguely impressed that Professor Snape hadn't made any of the mistakes other wizards tended to make when dressing as Muggles. He actually looked quite respectable. Not like Uncle Vernon though. Rather than a businessman, he looked like a teacher at a posh school. He had a black overcoat over dark gray wool trousers, and a charcoal blazer over a black sweater. His long hair was neatly confined in a ponytail at the base of his neck. He leaned tiredly on the black cane, his sallow face taut and lined. "Harry," Hermione's voice called. Harry turned to see she and Mrs. Granger hurrying to catch up. "I wasn't sure you were taking the train," she said. "I'm so glad. It feels almost..." She trailed off, turning a bit pink. Harry smiled. "It would make the trip less lonely." "Yeah, it feels almost normal," he said quietly. "Your mum in a hurry to get back?" Hermione gave him a wan smile. "She's a little unnerved. Flitwick offered to apparate us back again, but she's afraid she'd leave her stomach behind for sure, this time." Harry snorted. He could well imagine. They didn't have much to say. Even when the train came and they climbed onto it, no one spoke much. It had to be the most subdued ride Harry had ever taken. He and Hermione gave up trying to have a conversation after a while. Hermione sat next to him and read her book while Harry watched the countryside zoom by. Mrs. Granger and Professor Snape had a long conversation about something called TMJ that Harry paid no attention to. Mrs. Granger gave the professor a business card. Oddly, Snape appeared to give her one. Wizards had business cards. Fascinating. Harry dozed for a bit, his head leaning against the window. He was still cold, and burrowed more deeply into his jacket. Little bits of conversation drifted over. "Yes, Dursley. That's the name. School right now, I understand, shouldn't be difficult. Already have one report on the books." That was Snape's voice. Mrs. Granger's higher voice was easier to hear over the train's rumble. "So, where should I say I received the information?" "Oh, volunteer, daughter's school." Snape was facing the wrong direction. They won't want both children. It was frustrating to only hear half of what Snape was saying. "Arthur Weasley made the file. Notify them, the other one's already been taken into care. Find its way back." Sort of a someone else's problem charm. Quote. Harry slipped into a deeper sleep. The next thing he knew, Snape was poking him on the shoulder. "Potter. Wake up, we're there." Harry sat up, rubbing his eyes. His neck hurt a bit, from where he'd been sleeping awkwardly against the window. He was even colder and felt as though he was still half asleep. It was getting dark, as they headed into Muggle London. Harry kept close to Snape, not wanting to get separated as they walked to the parking lot. "Oh, it's no trouble," Mrs. Granger was saying. "It's on our way." "I do appreciate it," Snape said graciously. A man waved to them. Hermione gave a happy cry and waved back, hurrying to meet her father. Mrs. Granger turned back to Snape. "So where in Surrey did you say we were going?" "Little Whinging," Snape said. I have the directions. Harry stopped dead, feeling like he'd received a physical blow. No one noticed he'd stopped, in the momentary flurry of introductions. That liar. That bloody liar. Snape was going to take him back. Harry was aware that he'd backed up a step. He must have made a sound, because they all turned to look at him. Vernon would kill him this time. There was no doubt in Harry's mind. None at all. The only question would be, how quickly and how painfully. I'm not going back. Harry's voice shook. I'm not. I'll cut my own bloody throat before I go back. Snape looked genuinely surprised for a moment. Potter, what are you? Didn't Minerva? He shook his head irritably. No, obviously she didn't think to warn you. Neither did I. I'm not going back, roared Harry. He was breathing so hard he felt sick and dizzy. Black spots danced across his vision. He struggled to swallow down the threatening nausea. Snape stepped forward. Harry kept moving back until his back was against the side of a car. Harry wanted to run, but his legs trembled as though they wouldn't hold his weight. His hands tingled as he clenched and unclenched them. They were slick with cold sweat as he steadied himself against the car. Hermione darted to his side. Harry, come on, calm down, she said, gently. He bent over, put his hands on his thighs as he tried to get some control over his breathing. His vision was gray around the edges. Off, Hermione, you stop, he growled. Oh, very good, Potter. Cut in Snape, sarcastically, and if your mouth doesn't drive her a sufficient distance away, will you lash out physically? No, given your stature, you'd be better to do it magically. I should warn you, I suspect that Miss Granger would best you in a duel. Bugger off. I'm not going back, Harry replied hoarsely, trying not to retch. He wrapped one arm around himself and ceded one arm against the car. Unable to keep to his feet anymore, he slid down the car to the floor of the parking garage, sitting on the concrete. He bent forward, putting his head on his knees, the way the school nurse had shown him when he'd done this in school once. He'd heard Dudley and his gang were lying in wait for him. That didn't seem to help much. A wave of dizziness had him pulling his knees up under him. He knelt in a tight ball, his hands pressed flat to the floor, eyes tightly shut, not caring that tears were leaking from his eyes, just glad that he wasn't puking this time. Although, come to think of it, it would likely be just dry heaves. He hadn't so much as had a cup of tea since breakfast. Well, at least now Snape wouldn't be chasing him around about eating meals. He heard Snape's low voice say something to the Grangers. He felt someone kneel down next to him. The back of a hand felt his forehead, his cheek. You're cold as ice. Snape said, can you hear me? Harry nodded. Snape's hand left his face, then settled on his upper back, just at the base of his neck. Harry tensed, waiting for the hand to grab the fabric of his clothes and haul him to his feet. It didn't. Instead, it just rested there. I'm not taking you back to the Dursleys. If you would rein in your panic for 30 seconds, Potter, I will explain. Snape's voice was very soft and very close. Why you're lying, replied Harry. He understood, now, why the Dursleys always took him. They were well paid, so, they'd take him back, for however long it took. They'd make his life a living hell, and this time they'd overstep. This time his magic wouldn't work and fix him in time. He knew that could happen now. That's what happened to Neville. A mad hysteria threatened to break out into sobs. Harry stubbornly fought them down. Bad enough that everyone was watching an attack of his nervous stomach. Harry wouldn't stay there. One way or another, Harry would get out. Do you need an unbreakable vow, Potter? Rasped Snape. Harry had no idea what he was talking about. I dare say Granger is skilled enough to act as bonder. No idea they were that bad. Harry heard Hermione say to someone, probably her mum. Now, Hermione really had reason for all the pitying looks she'd been sending his way all term. Someone else settled down very close to him, but not touching Harry. It was Hermione's mother. Listen, Harry, Professor Snape's not taking you back to them. I won't let him. All right, he told me on the train that he needs to get something called a portkey from someone. I believe you know Mrs. Fig, asked Snape. Since we really don't want the entire wizarding world to be aware of your whereabouts, we plan to take you to Little Whinging first. Normally I would apparate from there. However, given current circumstances, it seems reasonable to Travel by portkey. Dumbledore will have dropped it off with Mrs. Fig. Harry didn't believe a word of it. Nobody spoke after that. Harry could feel them communicating over his head, and heard a few whispers behind his back, but frankly didn't care. He waited for Snape to lose patience. Perhaps he'd just give up this charade and call Uncle Vernon to get him to his feet and give him a clip around the ear. The cold of the concrete was sinking into his legs, which were beginning to cramp. "Can you manage to drink this, or must I spell it into you?" growled Snape, still far too close. Harry turned his head to the side. Snape held out one of Pomfrey's vials of pepper-ups. Almost as quickly as the panic descended, it was ebbing. It didn't matter if he did go back to the Dursleys, Harry realized. He could get away from them, any time he wanted. He just had to have the will. His trembling eased a bit. He pushed himself up from the ground. It was like this when this had happened before at primary school. Once it was over, it was over. It was embering that it had to happen, in front of a load of people. That had never happened before. "That's right, Harry," said Mrs. Granger. "Come on now, up you come." Snape's hand moved around from the back of Harry's neck to his shoulder. "Damn it, Potter," Snape said, without inflection. Harry began to stand, but the attempted movement from ground to upright threatened to send him pitching forward again. Snape steadied him, held the potion out. Harry took it meekly, rather hoping it was one of Snape's more potent poisons, at the moment. After drinking it, the world became a little more solid around Harry, less likely to spin. Mrs. Granger helped him to his feet. Hermione's father handed Snape back his stick. Snape used it to lever himself up from the ground. "Did you actually remember to eat today, at all, Potter?" Harry shrugged. Snape muttered darkly to himself about shock, and should have realized, and nobody having any sense, and needing to do everything his bloody self, and flipping Evanses and their flipping eating, all the rest of the way to the Granger's car. He put his hand back on Harry's shoulder. Perhaps to balance himself. More likely, to prevent Harry from making a break for it. Mr. Granger opened the back door, looking very worried. Hermione slid in the other side, so that Harry was effectively pinned in the back seat, between Snape and Hermione. Harry couldn't meet Hermione's eyes. He put his head back on the back of the seat and stared fixedly at the ceiling. Hermione's hand crept into his and squeezed. Harry's hand stayed limp. Every turn they took was familiar. Harry just blanked his mind. When the car finally stopped, he looked around cautiously. They were indeed on Magnolia Crescent, rather than Privet Drive. "Come on, Potter," Snape said, wearily. "I'm very tired." "Yes, sir." Harry started to relax just the slightest bit. He also began to feel very stupid as he clambered out of the car. "Oh, for the love of," Snape growled, with feeling, as Harry shut the car door. "Oh, and naturally they see us. We just had to park under the bloody streetlight." Harry stiffened as Snape put an arm around him, a gesture that would have seemed both friendly and intimate to any onlooker. Snape warned very softly, "Potter, stand right there. Don't move, don't speak, and don't have another bleeding panic attack." Harry was trapped, with Snape on his left and the car on his right. Harry was conscious that someone, it might have been Hermione, was standing behind him, leaning up against the car. Harry would be unable to bolt. Not that it mattered. Snape held him in an iron grip. Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon were striding up the sidewalk, on their weekly night out. By the looks of it, Vernon was dressed in his second-best suit and Petunia in her navy dress with the pearls. They recognized Snape and Harry as they drew closer. Uncle Vernon's eyes bugged. Aunt Petunia hid herself behind Uncle Vernon's shoulder, clutching her bag to her. A nasty smile spread across Vernon's face. "So, got tired of him already, did you? Figured out we're the only ones who can handle him. My sister was onto something, then. Well, the price has gone up." Harry grabbed at the side of the car, trying to keep from hyperventilating. Snape's hand tightened warningly on his shoulder. Harry noticed that Petunia was clutching Uncle Vernon's arm. "Vernon," she hissed in his ear. "Vernon, stop." The similarity to his own position was almost funny. "Don't be ridiculous," snapped Snape, in his most disdainful voice, all sign of weakness gone. Even the cane seemed an aristocratic affectation. "Mr. Potter and I are paying a social call on someone who lives nearby." Vernon's eyes narrowed. A social call. One of your lot lives here. Oh, there are few places in the world where wizards don't live, replied Snape, with supreme indifference. You might want to remember that, when you begin your flight. What? Asked Petunia, in confusion. When you flee this area, said Snape, in apparent surprise. Frankly, I'm surprised to find you still here. What are you talking about? Snapped Vernon. Talk sense. Snape didn't seem interested in speaking to Vernon. Instead he directed all his comments to Harry's aunt. You know, Petunia, I understand your parents died some years ago. I was very sorry to hear that. Your mother was often kind to me. I was very sorry I was unable to offer my respects at the time. That seemed a very bizarre topic change to Harry. And Snape knew his grandparents. Aunt Petunia seemed to think so, too. What do they have to do with anything? She spat. They've got nothing to do with you. And if you think that freak's getting any of my mother's things, you've got. Snape held up the hand that had been on Harry's shoulder. I only wish to point out that you should think on their manner of death, he said, quietly. Petunia's mouth twisted. Some of your lot killed them. I got a letter. It was because of whatever she was involved in. Just so. Nodded Snape. It is not uncommon, in wizarding warfare, to go after families. The wizarding world holds the bonds of blood and name most sacred, after all. And, after Lily was killed, did Dumbledore not explain that, by taking the boy, you would be completing protections your sister had set in motion by her sacrifice? He sounded like he was teaching a CL. Harry was trying hard to follow Snape, but this was all new to him. The minister had said something about wards the night he'd taken Harry back to the Dursleys when he'd run away. He said if we took him, this Voldemort's people couldn't get at him, she said grudgingly. She crossed her arms over her. I didn't want to, but I did it. Much thanks I got from the ungrateful freak. She sniffed, casting Harry a disgusted look. Did it never occur to you that those wards protected you, as much as they protected the boy? Snape inquired, in much the same tone he had been known to use when asking people why they had added a particularly explosive ingredient. What Snape had just said finally seemed to penetrate Petunia's what? She sputtered. I should think, if I were you, I'd be quite afraid right now. Snape said, silkily, but, perhaps you, Petunia, are made of sterner stuff. Your sister was a Gryffindor, after all. Afraid? Afraid of what? Demanded Uncle Vernon. Snape gave Uncle Vernon a long look, the slow painful death that most yearly waits for you, if you are caught by wizards. Vernon drew himself up to his full height, nearly matching Snape's. He raised his hand to point his finger at Snape's, stepping forward, until he and Snape were only a foot apart. You can't threaten me. I won't be intimidated. Harry tried to step back, but Snape's hand went around his shoulder. The warm weight of it was strangely calming. Threat? Asked Snape. Harry could hear the unpleasant smile in his voice. No, this is friendly advice. One of the most dangerous dark wizards from the last war has escaped Azkaban and is searching for Mr. Potter. Azka what? Vernon blustered. Nonsense. Petunia put both her hands over her mouth in horror. Snape went on as if he hadn't been interrupted. I should also point out, a great many of the Dark Lord's followers have escaped justice and would like nothing better than to revenge themselves upon the boy who lived. He shrugged. As I said, wizards hold the bonds of blood most sacred. I imagine killing you would seem like a way to get at him. The day you signed your rights over to me, those wards fell. I don't imagine it will take them long to find out. Both Harry's aunt and uncle stared at Snape. Then Aunt Petunia fairly shrieked, you never told us that. Dumbledore has to protect us. He said that Voldemort's people were all criminals. He said we'd have protection. Oh, I don't think so, Toonie, Snape spat, maliciously. Dumbledore and the Ministry have other problems, at the moment. While we're on the subject, I don't think you really want to attract the attention of the Ministry. Snape took his hand off of Harry's shoulder to draw out his wand, pointing it at Aunt Petunia. Petunia gave a squeak and threw her hand in front of her face. A roll of parchment appeared, unrolling itself in the air in front of Petunia. You see this? Snape ground out, pointing with his wand, as if at the chalkboard in CL. This is a listing of the boy's injuries, received under your care. Concussions, broken bones, malnutrition. I doubt highly that you want any of the supporters of the boy who lived to see this. What do you mean? Aunt Petunia looked stricken. With a shaking hand she reached out to touch the long scroll, but did not take it. He's a clumsy child. Accidents. Never ate as well as our dutters. Some children. Don't know what he's been saying. He makes things up, probably because of his mother dying. Don't you dare. Snape's dangerous voice cut her off. Do not presume to imagine we don't have methods to get the truth. I know all about the cupboard. His voice dropped to a whisper, and the rest. You need not fear Azkaban when this gets out, Toonie. Wizards who remember what Lily's sacrifice delivered us from will be here for their revenge. Will they kill us? Petunia asked just as quietly. Uncle Vernon's face had turned the color of sour milk, all bluster run out of him. That's a very good question, said Snape, rhetorically. You know, in cases like these, there are spells that can make you live through the boy's life for the last 13 years. Snape nodded at the long scroll. Examine your treatment of the boy and ask yourself, could you live through what you've doled out to him over the years? There would lie your answer. Vernon was sweating in the cool night. What are we going to do? He demanded. Snape waved his wand and the scroll disappeared. If I were you, I'd run. I would go home tonight and I would pack everything I could comfortably carry into one bag. I would obtain the fastest transport I could and I would run. Tonight. Chances are, the Death Eaters don't know the wards have fallen, so it is probably safe for you to track down a solicitor to sell your house and other ETS. If it were me, I would turn every ed I had into the most liquid form of currency I could. And then I would run, and never stop. But we got shut of him, objected Vernon. They can't blame us for keeping him now. You would have been better turning the child over to the Dark Lord's minions 12 years ago. Perhaps, they would have let you live. But they don't care for muggles on the best of days. If you had cared for the boy properly, the Ministry and Dumbledore would have moved heaven and earth to protect you. Snape sighed in mock regret. I fear you have chosen the worst of all possible courses. Every wizard you will ever meet will want to hurt you or kill you for your actions. Either for protecting the boy, or for harming him. I submit that your best chance is to be a moving target. Snape paused to consider. I understand that there are no wizards living on the Americans' Antarctic Research Station. Perhaps you could apply for work there. Snape put his hand back onto Harry's shoulder. Go now, I am quite tired of speaking to you. Harry could feel the professor tremble with exhaustion. But what about Dudley? Wailed Aunt Petunia. If you want your son to live, said Snape, softly, you will abandon him. Tonight, distance yourselves from him, and you may yet save his life. Professor Snape, called a different voice, what on earth are you doing, standing out there? Harry turned to see the little old lady who used to watch him for the Dursleys come hurrying down from her house. Don't stand out here all night. What's wrong with you? You know better. And you both look like death warmed over. Hello, Petunia, dear. Vernon. She took Snape's arm on one side and Harry's on the other and started urging them both toward her house. Sorry, dears, she said, to the shell-shocked Vernon and Petunia, no time to talk. Mrs. Granger hurried to Snape's side and whispered something to him. Thank you, very much Mrs. Granger. Snape told her, perhaps a bit impatiently, but probably as polite as he could under the circumstances, we'll be fine. One of us will give you a ring when we get settled. Mrs. Granger smiled tightly, climbing back into the car, which started and pulled away. The Dursleys were left under the streetlight, alone. Harry turned to take one last look at them. They stared at each other. Petunia choked out a few words that Harry didn't catch, and they both took off at a dead run towards Privet Drive. Aunt Petunia leaving her blue high heels lying under the street light. It was terribly unnerving for Remus to emerge at lunchtime from his rooms, to discover a note from Dumbledore in his office telling him that his clees had been cancelled for the day, rather than being covered by other teachers as had been agreed. Remus, paranoia spiked. He couldn't help but worry that perhaps his past indiscretions involving Black had come to light in some way. Surely, if Dumbledore were going to sack him, he would be waiting here to do it himself. Although, if that had happened, surely Aurors would be waiting here as well. However, as he made his way to check in with Poppy in the hospital wing, he saw a great many of the students missing from the Great Hall and the corridors far too empty this time of day. A note on Minerva's CL room door confirmed that it wasn't just his clees that were cancelled, it was all of the clees. Remus didn't like to speculate on what that might mean. If the corridors were too empty, the hospital wing was uncomfortably full. From the number of redheads, the entire Weasley clan had set up residence, along with a gaggle of healers from St. Mungo's. Remus saw at least 3 people wearing the uniform of St. Mungo's. Poppy was nowhere to be seen and Pomona was having a conversation with one of the healers. Arthur Weasley looked up at Remus as he came in. Arthur was sitting in a chair next to a sleeping Molly, looking a lot like Remus felt. Molly was sound asleep on one of the hospital beds, curled up in her cloak. Arthur saw Remus come in and gave him a tired wave and a half-hearted smile. Bill Weasley, the oldest Weasley boy, was there with him, having a serious conversation with his father and another stocky redhead who strongly resembled Molly. Remus recognized Bill from some freelance work he'd done for Gringotts a few years back. It could only be a family emergency that would bring him here, since Bill currently lived in Egypt, working for Gringotts as a cursebreaker. The other one would have to be Charlie, the next oldest, who currently resided in Romania. The Weasley twins were there, but Percy and Ron were missing. Perhaps one of them had been involved in some accident with a broom. No, Remus spotted them, each sacked out on a bed. Remus returned Arthur's greeting with an acknowledging nod. The door to Poppy's office was half open. Remus knocked and poked his head around the door. Poppy sat inside, drinking tea with a shaking hand, white as chalk, looking as though she had aged 30 years overnight. "Poppy," Remus asked, astounded, "what's happened?" He came in through the door, to sit down in the chair next to her. In answer, Poppy put her elbows on her desk, her head in her hands, and began to sob. Remus quickly stood to shut the door, his alarm turning to something akin to terror. As Poppy's crying increased in volume, he cast a silencio for good measure and returned to the chair. Poppy had not reacted this way the night the Longbottom boy had died. Nor when the healers had told them the little Hufflepuff girl had been interfered with. Ally. Nothing that had happened even in the war had caused this sort of breakdown. Yes, of course, he had seen her weep, or more often rage, but she was always controlled, always able to carry on with the task at hand. A momentary weakness would be suppressed with an iron will. This shaking, keening creature, rocking herself as she cried, was just not the Poppy he knew. At a loss, he gathered the older woman up in his arms, grateful that she was one of the few people who knew of his condition who didn't flinch from his touch. It was a full 5 minutes before Poppy calmed down enough to speak. I'm terribly sorry, Remus," she said hoarsely. I am not myself at the moment." "But what's happened?" Remus asked again, plaintively. He poured her another cup of tea, pressing it into her hand. "Can I get you something? A calming draught, perhaps?" "Oh, no, Remus." She held up her hand and shook her head. "I can't have that. It'll put me right to sleep again," she replied a little regretfully. He thought, "Just the tea." She blew on it, took a long sip. She closed her eyes, her mouth pulled down into a tense frown. "Last night, Ginny Weasley, well, it was a potions accident." Poppy spoke slowly, as though it were hard for her to think of what she was saying. "She was attempting an illicit brew. She nearly died. Minerva, Severus and I used the Tribuo Vita." "My God!" gasped Remus. "Are you all right?" "Minerva, is she?" He felt his heart drop into his stomach. Wizards had been known to die from that spell. Poppy's uncharacteristic hysteria began to make sense. Poppy nodded. "Yes, all fine. We were lucky we were all there. We had the triad to complete the spell, so that made it safe enough, and then the sheer energy from Severus." Poppy shook her head. "I would never want to duel him." "How did you?" Remus tried to wrap his head around what they had done. "So, Ginny Weasley. She'll recover," Poppy said, wearily, "but then, while we were tied up with that Sirius Black broke into the castle. He made it into Gryffindor Tower." Remus felt himself go still. "Was anyone hurt?" he asked softly, steeling himself for the answer. Poppy shook her head. Remus was very glad he was sitting. His knees would have gone weak with relief. "Poor Harry, though," Poppy went on, sadly, "he's having such a difficult time. He was down here, because he was one of the ones who'd raised the alarm over Ginny's accident. He's very close to the Weasleys, you know. Well, his familiar was up in the tower still, and it seems like he attacked Black. Chased him out of the tower and Black killed the poor thing. Blew him right up. Remus was having a little trouble following Poppy's rambling narrative. Black killed Harry's owl. He asked, confused. Oh, no. Poppy shook her head, as if realizing she wasn't making much sense. Sorry, you wouldn't know. Night before last, Harry brought him in. I forgot, you weren't feeling well. That was Poppy's code for Remus being too wolfishly irritable to be around people. Some moons were worse than others. With all the recent stress, this had looked like it was going to be a bad one. Remus had retired early with his potion and a calming draft. Poppy went on. Harry had been out after curfew. Severus found him out on the grounds. Turns out he's been feeding this great black dog all term and he'd fallen asleep out on the grounds with him. The dog was very protective of Harry. Nearly took Severus' arm off when he told Harry off. Well, you know how sharply Severus speaks. I suppose the dog thought he was going to hurt Harry. The dog knocked Severus right over and jumped on his wand hand, so he'd been a wizard's dog somewhere. The hair on the back of Remus' neck stood on end. A dog, you say? He swallowed hard. Oh yes, Harry's been nicking food for it all year. I understand he's been sneaking off to see it every afternoon. Severus had mentioned that he'd seen the boy sliding in late for dinner a few times, you know. I must say, I was relieved when I found out it was something like that, and not something, well, she trailed off, shaking her head. Remus was very, very glad that Poppy was not herself. Otherwise, she would notice how her words were affecting him. He forced his shoulders to relax, took a couple deep breaths. So, Black killed the dog? Remus asked slowly, trying to get her back to the point. Yes, the youngest Weasley boy's been keeping his dorm locked because one of the cats has been chasing his rat. Black broke in and was tearing the dorm apart looking for Harry and the dog just appeared in the middle of everything. Dumbledore thinks Black may have an invisibility cloak because the dog chased something out of the dorm, but the portraits didn't see anything. Of course, a dog would chase someone in an invisibility cloak by scent, wouldn't they? Remus nodded. Who saw Black kill the dog? He put his teacup down and put his hands on his lap so Poppy wouldn't see them shake. No one, not even a portrait. The dog chased Black down that blind corridor on the 3rd floor and Black blew him up. Black must have doubled back and disappeared, sighed Poppy. Blew him up. Remus blew out a long breath. Anything left of him? Just like poor Peter. Sniffed Poppy. Nothing left but a bloody collar. So, they haven't found Black? Remus asked, controlling his voice, with effort. No, not hide nor hair. It's been sheer bedlam all day. The ministry's called back the Dementors because of their affect on the children. The children are being sent home tomorrow, so the wards can be renewed. Poppy sipped her tea. I can't say I'm sorry. I'm not going to be much good to anyone, for a while. The parents are being pretty adamant about the school closing and the wards being renewed. So, the board is granting everyone a paid leave. Poppy's mouth quirked up in a grim smile. It's astonishing what a few well-placed letters from pure-blood parents can accomplish with fudge. That man's such a... She stopped, her cheeks going pink. I should stop talking now, she said embered. Poppy looked at Remus, a little blearily. Are you all right? Do you have anything that needs healing? Pomona can. Remus smiled. For the first time that morning, I'm fine, Poppy. The potion. I can't tell you the difference it makes. Remus had never been able to afford the Wolfsbane potion before. It was only the second time he'd been able to have it for the full week of the full moon. I owe Severus a bottle of fire whiskey, at the very least. The galleons for the potion ingredients were coming out of the Hogwarts funds, but Severus was donating his time to make it. The man had stiffly refused both Remus and Dumbledore's attempts to pay him for his time, remarking darkly that it was in his own best interests that Remus be rendered, mostly harmless. I'm afraid it's made me quite tired, however. Do you think anyone will miss me today? Remus lied. He wasn't ready to face Dumbledore until he decided how to deal with this latest. Poppy shook her head. I think it'll be fine. Half the teachers are leaving, as it is. Harry's all right, though. Dumbledore's sending Harry somewhere safe? Asked Remus, anxiously. A peculiarly satisfied look came over Poppy's face. Severus didn't care for the arrangements Dumbledore was making. Severus took him home with him. Remus stared at her, and Dumbledore let him. Is that wise? Poppy's eyes narrowed with displeasure. Dumbledore has absolutely no say in the matter. She said coolly, I spoke with Severus and I feel his plan is most sensible. But, Remus sputtered, is he really the right person? I mean Severus, as well aware of his duty. Poppy said, which is more than I can say for some wizards. She finished bitterly. Remus decided he didn't like to pursue this line of conversation with Poppy, at the moment. He might hear truths he would rather not know. If I'm not needed, said Remus, after a pause, I think I have some business to take care of. Poppy nodded vaguely, her eyes drooping again. Remus took her cup from her hand before it could spill and transfigured her chair into a settee. Oh no, Remus, she protested sleepily, I really must. Shish, said Remus, helping her put her feet up. You can at least have a lie down, if you won't go to bed. He, on the other hand, was going to look for that bloody dog. Severus was very relieved he had decided to travel by portkey rather than apparition. Not since the Dark Lord fell had Severus been so depleted. As it was, the encounter with Petunia had used up the last of his fading strength. He reminded himself that, when he had the chance, he needed to look up the side effects of the Tribuo spell. It was rarely used, one had to be in just the right place at the right time. The boy was in little better shape. His face was still that ashen color it had been when he'd collapsed in the parking lot. The pepper-up potion Severus had given the child would be wearing off soon. Mrs. Fig pushed them both to sit on her living room settee. She bustled about for a few minutes fussing around until they were both in possession of cups of sugary tea. All the time keeping up a chatter that Severus could hardly follow and decided it was best to simply ignore. Professor, the boy asked slowly, as he drank his tea when Mrs. Fig had finally left the room to go look for Dumbledore's portkey. It seemed like he was having a harder time than usual putting words into coherent speech. What, Potter? Severus tried not to snap. One of Mrs. Fig's cats leapt up beside Severus, demanding attention. Absently, Severus stroked the cat, feeling his raw nerves ease a bit as the cat purred. My aunt and uncle, are they really in danger? The boy looked at Severus, almost pleadingly. Severus nodded. He supposed he couldn't blame Potter for wanting a bit of petty revenge. Having me protected them, somehow. His voice was still slow, still with that pleading note Severus had never heard before. Yes, you'd have to ask the headmaster how that worked. Severus replied, thinking that the headmaster was going to owe the boy a great many explanations. I need to go back, then, the boy whispered. Potter sat with his head bowed of his teacup, so Severus couldn't see his face properly. Go back. Severus was sure he must have missed something the boy said. Potter took a deep breath, to the Dursleys. You have to give me back. His hand shook as he held his teacup. He shook his hair back as he looked up. Not half an hour ago you told me you were going to cut your own throat if I took you back, Potter. Growled Snape, in no mood for games. What the devil are you on about? Someone's going to hurt them. And what about Dudley? What'll happen to him? It's fine. I can handle Uncle Vernon. Potter spoke rapidly, his voice high-pitched. That's enough, Potter, said Severus, quietly. He was too tired to shout. No matter how infuriating the boy was being, I have no interest in listening to this. As for your cousin, Granger's mother is making a report to the Muggle authorities about him. I have no doubt she'll be able to have him taken into care. Especially, if the Dursleys take my advice and leave tonight. Potter goggled at him. Why would they take Dudley away from the Dursleys? Severus rubbed the bridge of his nose with his middle finger, wishing the boy would stop asking questions. However, these were the first actual questions Potter had asked about this whole thing, so Severus supposed they deserved an answer, because Madame Pomfrey and I are trying to arrange it for his protection. And because people who lock children in cupboards as punishment, should not be allowed to raise any children. Potter stared at Severus for a moment, then looked away. Shrugged. It wasn't like that. He said quietly, anyway, it wasn't punishment. They had to make room for me. And, I suppose you didn't just have a panic attack that sent you into a state of nervous collapse. Sneered Severus, unable to help himself. He filed the boy's words away in his mind for later reflection. It was a surprise and I guess I forgot to eat, today. Didn't feel well. I still don't. The boy admitted shakily, "I'm sorry, I sort of lost it." Potter looked up at him with a strange mix of shame and defiance. "So, Dudley's going to, what? Get sent to an orphanage or something? Because of me?" "No. He's going to get placed into an alternative living situation because his parents are abusive bastards," grated Severus, who just happened to get on the wrong side of the entire wizarding world. "Would you prefer they continue to have the opportunity to raise a sociopath who would probably be jailed by the time he was 21? Although, Severus privately thought it was too late to save Potter's cousin from that fate. Severus was spared Potter's reply by the return of Mrs. Fig. She carried a great basket in both hands. It appeared heavy by the way she hefted it. "Here you are, dears. I packed you up a nice dinner. I thought it was silly of me to keep you sitting here all night when you're better off at home, poor things. I went with Albus earlier and made up the beds." Mrs. Fig put the basket down at Severus' feet. Severus winced. He should have realized Albus would take it upon himself to tidy up a bit. The old woman pulled a wooden spoon from her pocket. "Here you are, Professor Snape," she said a bit too cheerfully. "It'll work you as soon as the both of you take hold of it." Severus wearily stood, making sure his leg was in contact with the large basket, accepting the spoon from Mrs. Fig. "Come along, Potter," he said, gesturing for the boy to stand. "Have you ever taken a portkey?" Potter stood up, shaking his head. "Take a hold of it, and it will activate and take us to my—" Severus hesitated. "Our home." The boy's gaze flickered upwards beneath the glees. Tentatively, the Potter reached for the spoon. "Make sure you're in contact with your belongings," Severus cautioned. Potter's hand paused. He looked at his backpack at his feet. "Stepped on the strap." Severus nodded approvingly. As Potter's hand closed on the handle, Severus felt the sensation of being pulled forward as though he had been hooked somewhere behind his navel. A whirl of color and light ped by them. Severus felt his feet connect solidly with the floor. Potter landed in a sprawl, by the sound of it. Severus couldn't see, the room was much too dark. He knew they were in the right place, though. He could smell the distinctive odor of his front room, composed of books, old wood, dusty furniture and disuse. "Professor." Potter's voice was a little panicky in the darkness. "All right, Potter, don't panic. Let me get the light." Severus pulled out his wand and lit it. The boy was, indeed, sprawling on the floor near the fireplace. Severus took 2 steps and reached over to flick on the light. Potter's expression was suspicious as he looked around the room, slowly climbing to his feet. "Why?" he began to ask, but he trailed off. He brushed his hand over the top of the end table next to Severus' favorite reading chair in an oddly fastidious gesture. "Why, what?" asked Severus. Potter didn't continue and Severus felt much too tired to press him. "Come along," he told the boy brusquely, picking up the basket. He switched on the hallway light, thinking of his bed longingly, but aware that he needed to feed the boy and himself, as well as lay down some house rules or Potter would, undoubtedly, have the whole place down around his ears in 2 days' time. Severus wondered distantly if mild to moderate insanity could possibly be a side effect to donating a piece of one's soul to another. That could be the only reason for his actions of the last day. He pushed away the memory of the image of Lily's accusing eyes as they stared at him from his dreams. Potter followed him quietly into the kitchen. Severus flipped on the light, glanced at the child, trying to gauge his reaction. The boy looked at the light switch as though it might bite him, then gazed around the tiny, old-fashioned kitchen in some confusion. Severus put the basket on the table and unpacked the various provisions Mrs. Fig had deemed fit to burden them with, while Potter seemed to get his bearings. Severus pulled out the pint of milk and half a dozen eggs from the basket. "Put these in the fridge," he said quietly. Severus wondered how Potter saw the place. Severus himself never spent much time in his kitchen, even when he was here, so he'd never bothered to change anything. The floor was a nondescript graying tile whose original color had long since faded from memory. Blue cupboards and drawers, the color his mother favored, with the stove and refrigerator in white. White porcelain sink and draining board. The memory of his mother cooking the dinner on the stove with her wand came to mind. She never trusted the gas stove not to blow them all up, so she'd always used a blue flame charm. Most nights Severus' father never noticed the difference. Once or twice the old drunk had noticed, and his fear of her magic was as great as her fear of the gas stove. Those nights were usually bad ones, around the Snape household. There's things in here," Potter said suddenly. "Won't they have gone off?" "It's not actually a fridge, anymore," replied Severus. He found the sandwiches that Mrs. Fig had made, grateful that he didn't have to dig around in his kitchen for an actual meal, stasis spell. "The bread box has one, as well." He nodded to the object on the counter, "and that cupboard." He pointed to the pantry cupboard. "I dislike waste." He summoned 2 plates from the cupboard and set the sandwiches on them. "Really? That's brilliant." Potter stared admiringly at the meager contents of the little fridge. Severus snorted. Surrounded as he was every day by wonders, the child was impressed by a simple household spell. "Come and eat," Severus said, irritably. The child picked his way through half a sandwich, before seeming to give up. Severus sighed to himself. He'd have to start feeding the boy more potion. That would wait, though. Severus worried that he and the boy would both pee out where they sat, if they stayed up any longer. "I trust you can manage breakfast in the morning?" Severus thought to ask. It occurred to him that Petunia was so useless, she might never have taught Potter anything as helpful as cooking. The way Severus felt, there was no guarantee he'd be up much before noon, tomorrow. Potter nodded, with a guarded expression. "The appliances are all Muggle, or they operate as if they are." Severus smiled to himself at Potter's look of surprise. "Don't burn the house down if you cook." Potter nodded again. "The bedrooms are upstairs. You'll have the guest room." Severus had never used it for anyone, but he'd furnished it years ago, and never bothered to change it. "Yes, sir," Potter said quietly, his face pale and pinched. It was long past time for them both to be in bed. That uncomfortable sense of wanting to say something kind and rurring came over him. He drew out the card with the Grangers' home number written on the back. "Would you call the Grangers in the morning and let them know we arrived without incident?" Severus thought that feeling less cut off might be good for the boy. Potter took the card with an air of open astonishment. "You have a telephone." He stared at the card and then back at Severus. "Right there." Severus pointed to the old-fashioned black dial telephone where it hung on the wall, beside the fridge. "The telephone company has long since forgotten this house's existence, but the phone itself still works." "Oh." Potter put the card down carefully in the middle of the table. "Come along, then." Severus put the rest of the basket and the remains of the food into the pantry. Unexpectedly, Potter jumped up, put the remains of his sandwich in the fridge and washed the 2 plates they had used, carefully stacking them on the draining board. So, at least the boy had been taught to wash dishes. That made some sense. Potter always finished detentions that involved scrubbing cauldrons very quickly and efficiently. The stairs seemed as long as any at Hogwarts tonight. At the top of the stairs, Severus opened the guest room, now Potter's room, he supposed, door. They were greeted by 2 enormous yellow eyes. "Hedwig!" cried Potter, going forward to greet his bird. Severus noted with approval that the rest of Potter's things had made it too. The window hung open slightly, the cold October wind chilling the room. "That wouldn't do." Severus cast a weather-repelling charm on the window. "You can leave the window open for your bird to come and go," he said. Potter seemed to have forgotten Severus was standing behind him, because he started a little. "Sir, the owl can get through the window, but nothing else." Severus nodded to the open window. "Oh, thank you." Potter smiled, tiredly. Potter definitely should not look that grateful for the simple courtesy a wizard accorded another wizard's familiar, Severus decided. The owl appeared to have only been waiting for them to greet her, before she went hunting for the evening. She nipped Potter's finger and gave Severus a little head bob, before she took off, out of the window again. Severus glanced around. The bed was indeed freshly made and turned down. Severus wondered how the modest bedroom compared to whatever the boy had at Petunia's. Severus had only seen the Dursleys' front room, after all. It was Lupin who had gotten the grand tour and they had not spoken of it at all, beyond Lupin confirming the tale of locked doors and barred windows. There was an awkward pause. "Well, good night, Potter." Severus was so tired his eyes were blurring. "Good night, sir." Light shining in Harry's face woke him the next morning. He struggled awake, felt around for his glees. Putting them on, the first thing he saw was the roaring shape of a snowy owl, fluffed up and motionless, by the window. "Hey, girl," Harry said, softly. He didn't want to wake her if she was really asleep, but he did like to know she was all right. Hedwig opened one eye. gave a contented little chirrup, then sleepily closed it again, settling in for a sleep on the perch that had been left for her. By the look of the light, it was at least 9 o'clock. Snape wasn't banging on his door, so Harry supposed sleeping so late must be all right, for now. The house was very, very quiet. It didn't seem as though Snape was up yet. The professor had looked pretty rough by the time they'd gotten here last night, so Harry supposed that made sense. The bedroom Snape had given him was smaller than the one he'd occupied on Privet Drive, but it was worryingly devoid of locks. In fact, it appeared that the only lock on the door bolted from the inside. It was decorated in a muted beige. The bedclothes, carpet and curtains all looking as though they'd been spelled to be as inoffensive a color as possible. If it was a guest room, Harry supposed that made sense. Harry's trunk was pushed up against the wall, next to Hedwig's perch. Hedwig's cage was also pushed up against the wall, as if no one expected it to be used. Under the perch was a tray of newspaper, similar to what generally went into the bottom of Hedwig's cage. It was a setup much closer to what Hedwig was accustomed to at Hogwarts or the Weasleys. When he thought about it, Harry felt stupid for being surprised. Of course, Snape would be accustomed to owls. Harry lay in bed for another minute or two, trying to figure out what he should do. Snape had asked Harry if he could manage breakfast. Did he mean for both of them? Or just for Snape? No, it must be for both of them. The way Snape chased him around about eating, Harry was fairly certain Snape meant for him to get his own breakfast as well. Harry slid out of bed. He hadn't bothered to undress properly last night. He'd just taken off his jeans. He peeked into the hallway. Snape's bedroom door was firmly shut. Harry decided to chance a quick shower. Hopefully this wouldn't be the sort of house whose loud plumbing would wake the professor. Ron had always been surprised by Harry's ability to get in and out of the bathroom inside of 5 minutes, if he had to. Ron said that his brothers could take hours, never mind who else would be waiting. When Harry was done, the house was still silent. It was a bit creepy, actually. Not liking to make more noise than necessary, he crept down the stairs in his stocking feet. The old-fashioned clock in the kitchen said 9:30. Harry dug around in the fridge and cupboards to see what was there. Just milk and eggs were in the fridge. No sausage or anything. Harry reckoned he would make omelets then. He was good at those. Petunia had been given a whole cookbook full of omelet and omelet-like things. She'd made 2 or 3 recipes out of it, before she decided it was too much trouble. She'd given the book to Harry after that. Further digging found some cheese to go into the omelets. They had a half-dozen eggs, so Harry used all of them. Sifting through the cupboards, Harry found an actual omelet pan. He fancied he would have liked some mushrooms or something to liven them up a bit. He shook his head at himself ruefully. It wasn't as if he was going to be able to impress Snape, of all people. By 10 o'clock, breakfast was ready, but still no Snape. He wondered what to do with the food so that it would stay hot. If he put it in the oven, it would be dried out and disgusting in about 10 minutes. He couldn't just put a warming charm on it, since as far as he knew, he still wasn't allowed to do magic away from school. There was no way that Harry was going to try to wake Snape. Snape had said the bread box had a stasis charm on it. That would work. In fact, that was better than a warming charm, which had a tendency to render the food inedible if left too long, not unlike heating it in an oven. Harry took out the half loaf of bread, putting that in the pantry, and stuck the plate in there with the hot teapot. Harry ate his own breakfast, the quiet beginning to really get on his nerves. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. Would Snape want him to keep to his room, or would he want Harry to be doing something else? Harry washed his breakfast dishes, taking comfort in the prosaic task. Snape's kitchen was really a pleasant little room, if one ignored the grime that seemed to cover everything. The cornflower blue cupboards and white sink gave it a hominess that Petunia's pristine, antiseptic kitchen always seemed to lack. The fridge was only a half-sized and had to be older than Snape. The stove was the same. The kitchen table was wooden, painted the same color as the cupboards, with no tablecloth. It had seen better days, but Harry was sure it would be very nice if it were cleaned. Idly, Harry started to wipe down the counters when he was done with the dishes. The trouble with cleaning one part of the kitchen, Harry decided, was that it made the rest of the room look shabbier. He searched around, not finding a mop or broom. He finally found a pile of rags buried in the back of the sink cabinet, behind a bottle of some variety of all-purpose cleaner. There wasn't much there. Harry supposed, if Snape ever bothered to clean, he must use magic. The window over the sink was dingy, and looked out onto an overgrown back garden that was surrounded by a low wall. Frowsy white curtains, that had also seen better days, hung on either side of the window, half obscuring the view. Without giving it any real thought, Harry filled the sink full of water and poured the cleaner in, taking some time to give the counter, cabinets and table a proper wash. Not having a broom was irritating. He would have liked to sweep. He washed the little kitchen window and wondered if Snape had a washing machine. If so, he could wash the curtains. By the time he finished cleaning the kitchen almost to his satisfaction, he still hadn't swept or mopped and the stove interior needed cleaning. It was getting on for noon. Harry wondered if he should check to see if Snape was even alive. Halting footsteps, coming from upstairs signaled that the professor was probably still with the living. Harry whisked the rags back under the sink, not liking to give Snape a reason to complain that he'd left the job half done by leaving his cleaning things out. The bathroom door opened and shut. After a moment, Harry heard the sound of the shower running. Uncertainly, Harry hovered in the kitchen for a moment. Making up his mind, he took the professor's breakfast out of the bread box and put it on the tea tray he'd found while cleaning. He filled the small milk jug and included the sugar bowl, since he couldn't remember if he'd seen Snape take sugar. Whenever Uncle Vernon or Dudley was sick, Aunt Petunia had insisted that they be served their meals in their rooms. Carefully, Harry took the meal up to Snape's room. The door hung half open, so all Harry had to do was slip in with the tray. The room was disappointing in that it appeared so normal. No bats, or skulls or peculiar things floating in jars. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves covered 2 walls. The bed faced towards the window which had a low table under it. Harry put the meal there. The curtains were a dark burgundy and kept the light out admirably. Harry opened those to let in the thin sunlight. The window had a view of the street outside. Going by the buildings opposite him, Harry could see they were on a street of bleak little row houses. The walls not covered with bookshelves were white with dark green trim. The musk bed had simple white sheets with a comforter that carried the burgundy and dark green coloring. The carpet was dark green and needed a vacuum. Snape's bedclothes were tossed around as if the man had slept badly the night before. Without thinking about it, Harry shook the sheets out and made the bed, making sure it was made to Petunia's exacting standards. Harry hoped that Snape wasn't going to drown, given the amount of time he was spending in the shower. Not wanting to intrude on the man's privacy, he retreated downstairs when he heard the water stop running. The kitchen felt quite cozy, now that it was clean, with the early afternoon sun shining through the window. Harry took a moment to look around the kitchen again, pleased with the morning's work. He'd have to find a broom and a mop soon. Perhaps some bleach would be able to clean off the floor tile. He retrieved one of the rags from under the kitchen sink. There was no furniture polish under there either. Perhaps Snape kept his cleaning things somewhere else. The living room was badly in need of dusting and Harry's nerves were too jangled to let him keep still. It seemed absolutely surreal that he was here, in Snape's home. He remembered then, the way Snape had called it, our home. The footsteps overhead walked from the bathroom to Snape's bedroom. Harry dusted the whole front room before he heard any footsteps again. A lot of Harry's childhood had been spent listening to footsteps, judging the mood of the adults in the house from the volume and cadence of the steps. Quick, light steps were safe enough. Slow, deliberate steps needed caution and heavy thumps meant to get out of Uncle Vernon's way. Snape was still rather unsteady, if the pauses on the stairway meant anything. Harry realized that the stone floors at Hogwarts had accustomed him to his teacher's boots clicking rather than thumping. Snape's footfalls were always purposeful. That is when you could actually hear them. Plenty of times the man would just seem to appear right behind you. Harry listened to Snape lurch down the stairs to the kitchen. Dishes rattled into the sink. Water ran, so perhaps Snape was doing his own dishes. Harry wondered if he'd be in trouble for that. On the other hand, if he dashed in to take the task over, Snape might get annoyed. It was a no-win situation, as usual. "Potter, where've you gotten to?" snapped the professor from the kitchen. Harry stowed his dust rag in his pocket. "I'm here," he said, hurrying into the other room. He stood in the doorway, not sure if he should sit down with the professor or not. Snape was sitting at the kitchen table, his chair back to the wall, glaring around the room. He was dressed in a pair of jeans and a gray sweater, his hair still damp from his shower. It was a little startling to see him out of his usual black. Even stranger to see him wearing something other than wizard robes. "Did you eat this morning?" the professor asked, his arms folded across his long legs stretched out. Harry resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He didn't want to irritate Snape, for all that Snape had assured Harry that he wouldn't raise a hand to him. Harry reckoned it was just a matter of time before Snape forgot that. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. Snape glared at him some more. "What have you been doing all morning?" demanded the man. Snape must be irked that the rest of the house hadn't been seen to. Certainly the kitchen floor should have been swept and scrubbed, Harry knew. "Slept late," Harry admitted, a little shamefaced, waiting for one of the man's scathing lectures. Something about the man's glare softened around the edges. That must have been an acceptable answer. "Yes, well, given the events of the past 2 days, I can't say I'm surprised." Harry just nodded. It seemed the safest thing to do. "I'm afraid I'm not quite myself yet, Potter," continued Snape, tiredly. "I hope it's not too much to ask if you can keep yourself occupied and out of trouble for a few days. The school wards are going to take several weeks to renew." The tone lacked Snape's usual bite. Harry thought he must not be feeling like himself at all. Snape reached into his pocket and pulled out a wristwatch. "If you leave the house." "I can leave the house," interrupted Harry, without thinking. "You meant he'd be stuck here." Snape fixed him with his familiar cold stare. "Sorry," Harry muttered. Snape threw the wristwatch onto the table. "Put that on," he said. Harry picked the thing up and stared at it. It looked like a plain digital watch, except instead of numerals, the face read, "Safe." "It's keyed to my household wards," Snape explained. "I'm the only wizard hereabouts. If another wizard pays my wards, the alarm will go off and it will become a portkey and bring you back here. If you leave the wards, it will do the same. My wards extend to about a 5-minute walk in every direction." Harry picked up the watch and put it on slowly, feeling a little like he was putting on some kind of tether. "Don't imagine you can leave the house without it," Snape sneered. "The door won't open to you if you don't have it on." So much for no locks on the doors, thought Harry. He kept his mouth shut, since there wasn't a thing he could say that wouldn't get him in trouble. "If you need anything," Snape went on, "I keep some Muggle money in the drawer over there." He pointed with his chin to the bottom drawer. "If you want to order takeaway, there's a rather good Indian up the street," he finished, almost contemplatively. Harry had never had Indian, but he wasn't going to tell Snape that. Snape closed his eyes and leaned his head against the wall. Harry tensed, worried that the man was going to topple over, or something. "Can I get you something, Professor?" Harry asked, anxiously. Snape just shook his head, still with his eyes closed. He looked like Vernon, after he'd been out too late the night before. Not knowing what else to do, Harry put the kettle on. Snape must have fallen asleep again. His breathing was slow and even. He didn't even move the whole time Harry was making the tea. When it was finished, Harry poured Snape a cup, setting it down in front of the man. With a faint click, no response. Harry watched the man breathing, just to make sure he was still doing it, before Harry went back to his dusting. As long as Harry was in motion, he didn't have to think about anything. When the whole of the downstairs was reasonable, not really clean yet, but at least Harry wouldn't be embered if someone came to the door, Harry went back into the kitchen. Snape was still dozing. With his head back like that, Harry was sure the professor was going to wake up with a terrible kink in his neck, and wouldn't that help the man's mood? Taking a deep breath, Harry tiptoed up next to the man. He called softly, "Professor." At the same time, Harry reached out to shake the man's shoulder. As soon as Harry touched him, Snape started, pulled his wand from somewhere. He drew it so quickly that Harry wasn't sure from where exactly, and aimed it straight at Harry. Harry heard no incantation, but he was suddenly completely unable to move. Snape stared at him, for what felt like an age, his expression murderous. Harry felt his heart pounding in his and noticed the spell didn't stop him from trembling with fear. He also discovered, to his utter horror, that tears had started down his cheeks, that he could neither hide, nor blink away. Snape blinked a few times, staring at Harry as if he'd never seen him before. The man seemed to say something to himself that Harry didn't catch, and he gave his wand a little wave, canceling the spell. "Potter," he said, his voice flat. He swallowed. "You startled me." Harry found he could move again. He turned away from the man, his throat tight. "What was that for?" he demanded, rubbing his face to get rid of the tears. "I took you for someone else," replied Snape, quietly. "I did not mean to frighten you. I am overtired, I think." That was probably as close to an apology as Harry was ever likely to get. "You didn't," he returned harshly, getting a grip on himself. Harry's heart slowly stopped racing. It had just been an immobilizing spell, after all. They were completely harmless. Come to think of it, Harry didn't like people shaking him awake. He supposed was very likely lucky that Snape hadn't cast something either lethal or painful at him. He and his CL mates had been using various immobilizing spells on each other since last year. Hermione had cast one at Neville in their first year. Thinking of Neville made Harry's heart contract in his. He shook his head to clear it. The silence was awkward. Harry turned around to see Snape casting a warming spell on his cup and adding sugar. "Would you like some tea, Potter?" asked Snape, sounding as though he were attempting to bridge the awkwardness. Harry thought the offer of tea was more awkward than Snape hexing him. "No, thank you." Harry hesitated. There were a few things I wanted to buy. They were out of eggs and almost out of milk, and Harry had no idea what he was going to make for dinner. "Is there a shop anywhere?" Snape nodded. "Just up the street, there's a few shops." Harry went to the drawer where Snape had said he kept Muggle money. A collection of notes and coins sat in what was otherwise a junk drawer. Harry was not expecting there to be quite this much. He took out what he thought was enough so he could do the food shopping. Harry heard a small sigh from behind him. When he turned, he saw that Snape had fallen asleep with his head on the table. "Professor," called Harry, not touching the man, this time. "What?" Snape asked groggily, his hand tightening on his wand that he had not put away. He lifted his head to look at Harry. "You, fell asleep again," Harry said with concern. "Is that normal? After that spell you used?" Snape nodded, his eyes bleary. "I suppose so. Listen, why don't you go back to bed?" Harry heard himself using the voice Petunia used to cajole Dudley and Vernon. Snape peered around the kitchen. "For a moment, I suppose." "Come on then, sir," Harry said a little impatiently. He couldn't very well carry Snape to bed. The man was a menace like this. The older wizard shook his head and rubbed his eyes, finally staggering to his feet. Harry was at his elbow right away. "Get off, Potter," muttered Snape, but without any real anger. "I can manage." Harry stepped back. "So, it's all right if I pop out for a few minutes?" he asked, as the man headed up the stairs. He felt he needed to make absolutely sure. Snape paused, nodded without looking back. "Take your wand, but unless you are in fear for your safety, do not use it. I thought this thing was supposed to bring me back here if the wards are broken." Harry indicated the watch he was wearing. "You said people other than wizards can be dangerous." Snape replied darkly. "It will bring you back if you're beaten unconscious by the local hooligans, as well. I presume you'd rather avoid that." "Oh." Harry wished he had Snuffles to take with him, then he winced inwardly. The dog was yet another thing he didn't want to think about. Harry went to find his trainers and his coat. His heart lifted a little at the prospect of an outing, even so mundane as food shopping. Opening the front door, he found himself halted by sound. After the quiet of the house, he was surprised by the sheer noisiness of the street. Harry realized Snape must have a permanent silencing charm on the house. Not even the fridge had made a sound. But, out here, the distant sound of car engines and smell of petrol fumes told him that they were very near a motorway. The street itself was rather rundown, just as the view from the upstairs window promised. Harry looked both ways on the street, spotting a little row of shops that seemed to be the ones Snape had indicated. So intent was Harry to get his errands done, that he never noticed the elderly woman in a pink coat, eyeing him as she locked her own door, until she spoke. "Hello there, dear," she said. "Have you just moved in?" "I didn't know they'd put the house up on the market." Harry started. He must be as jumpy as Snape. No, I haven't, that is. I'm only here for a few weeks." I'm staying with Professor Snape, sputtered Harry. He had no idea what the old woman might know of Snape, so he had no idea what he was supposed to say. The old woman stared at him, then her eyes lit with comprehension. So it's Professor Snape, is it? That's why he's only here in the summer. I always did wonder. He always keeps to himself, so I never get the chance to ask. Of course, his father was the same. Quiet, you know. Harry nodded, desperately hoping he wasn't going to be in trouble with Snape for talking to the old woman. Petunia hated for Harry to talk to the neighbors. The old lady went on, but, why are you both here, now? The school needs some repairs. There was a bit of an accident, you see. Harry replied, making up a story on the spot, plumbing. Oh, I see, she said, sounding as if she didn't. Well, it's a boarding school, you understand, and my family. Harry didn't quite know where to go next. My family doesn't want me back. There's no one who wants me. Snape's stuck with me. The old woman was looking at him expectantly, as he trailed off. Professor Snape had to bring me with him, until school's repaired. Harry finished lamely, shrugging. Is this the same school Professor Snape went to? She asked, quite kindly. I think so. Harry told her. He didn't mean for it to come out as a question. Oh. She said, you must be terribly clever, then. The woman smiled. I knew Professor Snape's parents. He went to a school for the gifted and talented, his mother told me. Harry smiled, breathing a sigh of relief. Yes, ma'am. That made the old woman laugh. Oh my dear, don't, ma'am, me. I'm not the queen, I'm Mrs. Cook. Now, do you know where you're going? Severus stood outside of the Gryffindor common room, uncomfortably aware of the stares he was receiving from the Gryffindors who ped by. Finally, one of the girls in Lily's year seemed to take pity on him. She actually listened to him as he made his plea and promised to take his message to Lily. A moment later, Lily stood in front of him. Lily, I'm sorry, he said plaintively, I didn't mean it. Her eyes were blazing. You drew a wand on my son. She growled, how dare you? Was that what happened? He didn't remember what he'd done. All he knew was that he'd buggered something up. I'm sorry. Memory started to fill in. The boy staring at him, unable to move, tears trickling down his frightened face. He startled me. I didn't mean to. It just happened. He took a step towards her. They were in the kitchen of his home on Spinner's End, not at Hogwarts at all. Lily had her arms folded across her. Don't do it again, she hissed. No, of course not. Severus agreed quickly. I'm sorry. It's not me you need to apologize to, she said harshly, and you're not the only one. Only one what? Who needs to apologize to Harry? Another voice said, quietly. Severus turned to see James Potter standing in the doorway of the kitchen. Severus stiffened, crossing his arms over his. What are you doing here? He hissed. James slouched in, while Lily glared at both the men, her fierce attitude warning them both to behave. Come in and sit down, snapped Lily, to James. Severus opened his mouth to protest, but the look Lily turned on him made him shut it again. James sat at the kitchen table. I expect all the adults in Harry's life owe him an apology. Lily's husband sat with his elbows on the table in front of him, his hands resting palms down with the fingers curved. Severus stared at the man's hands, realizing that the younger Potter's hands were very different. James's hands were broad and short-fingered, capable and strong. Harry's fingers were long and fine-boned, almost delicate. The hands of an artist or a musician, or a potions master, Severus realized with a start, looking at his own hands. How could he have missed that? James looked up to catch Severus' eye. I'm sorry. Taken aback, Severus asked, in the iciest voice he could muster, I beg your pardon. I'm sorry that we never had a chance to talk this over. Sorry that I never had the chance to thank you. James ran a hand through his hair. I wanted to. Thank me. Severus shook his head, confused. Severus woke with a gasp and a start. This was getting unnerving. He'd been dreaming of Lily since this whole thing started, but now to be dreaming of James Potter. Severus sat up, feeling stiff. The room's darkness was so complete that it looked the same whether his eyes were open or shut. He reached over and turned on the lamp, wincing a bit when the light dazzled his eyes. The clock read 3:30. so he'd slept about 14 hours, he hadn't slept through to the next day. He was thirsty, needed to use the toilet and felt like he could do with another shower. He glanced at the pocket watch that lay on the bedside table. The watch only had one hand, marked HJP. Rather than numbers, it had words. Right now, it pointed to the word where the number 9 would normally be, sleeping. That was worrying. Of course, the alarm would go off if the hand pointed to mischief, or mortal peril, keyed as it was to Potter's magical signature and Severus' own household words. Molly Weasley had spelled the watch for him. Grudgingly, Severus had to admit that Mrs. Weasley was actually a rather formidable witch. He had never thought of it before, but she was, in her own way, as powerful as any of the Hogwarts heads of house. Her speciality was protective spells with 7 children. Severus supposed it would have to be. Her own family clock was quite efficacious apparently. The Weasley family clock's alarm had started ringing as soon as the hand of the clock that represented the girl had reached mortal peril. According to Dumbledore, Molly, she had insisted that Severus call her by her given name, had been frantically trying to contact both Minerva and Dumbledore, at the same moment she received the headmaster's message about her daughter. When Severus had asked her to put an alarm on the watch for mischief, Molly had laughed at him. Severus couldn't find it in him to be offended. Her laughter was more nerves and exhaustion than amusement. If my clock went off every time one of my children were up to mischief, she'd said, I'd never get any sleep. She'd added the alarm for him, though. Every time Severus had woken, he'd checked the watch. In the afternoon it had pointed to shops, then home. Surprisingly, at no point did it even get close to mischief. Slowly, with many pauses, Severus made it to the bathroom and back. This time, the bed wasn't made, so Severus assumed that the elf Albus had sent them must also be sleeping. That was all to the good. Severus was going to have words with Dumbledore about that. He knew how Severus felt about the creatures. It was fine for them to be the Hogwarts staff. Any school would need staff, but Severus drew the line at them following him home. When he'd first started teaching, an elf had followed Severus home. The elf ignored to look after Severus' rooms at Hogwarts. Apparently, each teacher had an elf ignored to them and most of the teachers would borrow the elf for the summer holidays. It had taken a few days that time, but Severus had eventually caught the elf in the kitchen and given it a direct order to go back to Hogwarts and stay there. The poor thing had been quite put out until Severus had given it a job. He'd told it that he'd rather have it keeping the castle with the other elves. It wasn't the elves themselves that bothered him. Severus was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of keeping S. He supposed it was his Muggle heritage showing through, but all the arguments for keeping house elves were the exact same ones that had been espoused for keeping human S at one time. He kept his thoughts on that to himself, of course. Such attitudes did not endear one to pure blood society, but as Severus had grown older, pure blood society mattered less and less. When Severus had tottered back from the bathroom, he saw that the elf had done some minor rearranging, at some point during the day. The bread box from the kitchen sat on the table by the window. Severus opened it slowly, wondering what on earth it was doing there. Inside the bread box, kept at the proper temperature by the stasis charm, was a plate of shepherd's pie, a few slices of bread, the small teapot, and a little jug of milk. A teacup and the sugar bowl sat beside the bread box. Severus shook his head, deciding that he was going to have some serious words with Dumbledore. This was a little more initiative than house elves generally took, but it was a clever way to avoid direct contact with Severus. That way there was no chance that he could order the elf away, and if he didn't know its name, he couldn't very well call it to himself in order to do that. Biting back his irritation, Severus sat down to eat. The shepherd's pie was a different recipe than what the elves generally made at the castle. Still quite palatable, but heavier on some of the spices and lighter on the salt. Likely, this was a recipe the headmaster favored. As he had in the afternoon, Severus took his dishes down to the kitchen himself. It would take more than doing his own dishes to convince the house elf to leave, Severus knew, but it was the principle of the thing. He wasn't tired enough to go back to bed, yet. He put the kettle on and went into the front room to look for something to read. He still wanted to look up the side effects of the Tribuo spell. He had at least 2 books that made reference to it. To his surprise, Potter was asleep on the settee, a low fire in the fireplace. One of the electric lamps had been left on. A book that Severus recognized from his own shelves was laying across the boys. Apparently Potter had fallen asleep reading. Severus sat down on the chair near the fire, his dream coming back to him as he stared at Potter's hands. He had been correct, the boy's hands were very like his own. He remembered a conversation he'd had with Lily, the last time he'd seen her. The only time Severus had seen the child before Lily's death. At the time, he'd been much more concerned with Lily's plans for keeping herself safe than with the baby. It was just before they went into hiding, so that would have made the boy, perhaps, 11 months old. Lily and her son were staying at Hogwarts until their safe house could be arranged. The elder Potter and Dumbledore had been visiting a proposed site that day and Severus had come to make a report to Dumbledore. He'd seen her in the corridor, taking the child out for a bit of sun. Severus insisted on walking with her. Hogwarts was secure, but Severus still felt apprehensive letting Lily walk alone. They'd sat by the lake, talking seriously about the war while the baby pulled up bits of GR and threw them into the air. He'd not taken much notice of the black-haired bundle that Lily held so precious, to be honest. Until the bits of GR the baby threw up into the air stayed in the air. The child laughed with astonishment and reached for the GR, while Lily laughed with joy. It had been the child's first magic. A moment that was celebrated in wizarding families like a child's first steps or first words. "James will be sorry he missed this," she'd said. In a rare moment of playfulness, Severus had summoned a few daisies and sent them to dance with the blades of GR, much to Lily and her son's delight. Only one other time had Severus laid eyes on the boy, before he'd come to Hogwarts, but that didn't bear thinking about. When the boy had arrived at Hogwarts, Severus had been quite happy to hate him on sight. The child's existence was a knife to his gut, a living reminder of Severus' guilt. He wished every day that he'd refused Lily. Severus couldn't help but think that he was damned thrice over. If he'd never agreed to Lily's scheme, she might not have been with child, and the Dark Lord would never have targeted her. It would have been better if she had gone to a Muggle sperm bank. Odds were, it would have taken a year or more for her to conceive. Perhaps they would have given up entirely, chosen some war orphan to adopt. Then again, if she had mothered a squib, their little family might be safe and whole now. Of course, if things had gone differently, the Dark Lord would possibly still be in power. The Dark Lord's supporters had been many. With the full weight of the pure-blood wizards behind him, the Dark Lord seemed poised to gain complete control over wizarding Britain. If the Dark Lord's ambitions had been realized, as a Muggle born, Lily's life wouldn't have been worth half a canute. One of the reasons Severus had taken what he'd overheard that night in the hogshead to the Dark Lord, he just thought it was a piece of information that no one else had. His former master had valued such things as proof of loyalty. Severus had been trying desperately to curry favor with the Dark Lord. He had hoped, among other things, to use the influence to protect Lily. Severus had never thought the Dark Lord would put so much stock in the ravings of an alleged seer. And he certainly never imagined he'd put it together with the Potters. When he realized his mistake, Severus had told the Dark Lord that he desired Lily, a motivation the Dark Lord could understand. Love, whether friendship, familial or romantic, was beyond the Dark Lord. Severus sincerely doubted the man. Was he a man anymore? Had ever had a lover, male or female? However, the Dark Lord understood lust, avarice and the need for power over another. He viewed Severus' request in that light, and it had been easy to convince the Dark Lord that Severus wanted Lily not only to warm his bed, but as a kind of revenge against an old foe. The Dark Lord had given Severus a promise: he would spare the woman's life. She need only to give up the child and she could live. That was when Severus went to Dumbledore. He knew in his soul that his friend, his Lily, a true healer in her heart of hearts, would never step aside to let anyone be harmed, let alone her precious child. James Potter had sent a message to Severus, through Dumbledore, days before he died. A note that had asked Severus to do whatever he had to do to protect Lily and Harry, if something were to happen to him. He'd laid it on Severus' shoulders to keep his family safe. Severus had failed miserably on every count, it seemed. Drops of water fell onto Severus' hands, startling him. For a few seconds, he stared in confusion at the moisture, before he realized he was weeping. He wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand, getting himself under control. It wasn't like him to have his emotions so close to the surface. The sleeping boy turned his head. Severus could see his profile in the light of the electric lamp. It wasn't James Potter's profile that he saw then. The child's face, in the dim light, was all Evan's. The boy's nose was like Mr. Evans and the mouth coming from Lily's mother's side. It did have those pieces that stuck up, making it impossible for the hair to lie down flat, just like James, but the color could have come from anywhere. Perhaps Lily hadn't used James's whole hairbrush, after all. The child turned over again, then sat up suddenly. He stared at Severus with wide eyes. Severus wasn't even sure the boy was actually awake. "Potter," he rasped, "what are you doing in here?" The boy shook his head. "Professor?" he asked, anxiously, squinting at Severus. "Yes, Potter," Severus replied, evenly. The boy seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, fumbled around for his glees, couldn't sleep. He muttered, locating them and putting them on. The Evans resemblance was subdued now. The boy looked more like Lily's husband, with the scruffy hair and glees being his most prominent features. "It appears you have managed to fall asleep in here, however," Severus returned. The boy shrugged. "I started a fire. Thought it might help me sleep." He gathered up the blanket from the settee and wrapped it around himself. "I'll get out of your way, sir," he said, moving to stand. "Never mind, Potter," sighed Severus, "I was only coming to get a book. But now you're awake, I suppose you'd like some tea." Severus didn't know what possessed him to offer the boy tea. He just had a vague might have some more success drawing the boy out of himself. He'd found with the students in his house that there were things that could only be spoken of in the dead of night. It was almost comical, the look of puzzlement that came over the boy's face. "Stay there," Severus said, rising to get the tea. When he returned, Potter had poked up the fire and was staring at it. Severus put the tea tray down on the coffee table, poured 2 cups, handing the first to the child. Severus wasn't sure how to start this conversation. Most of the time, when he had this sort of encounter with one of the students in his house, they were falling over themselves to unburden their souls. He seldom had to do more than provide a willing pair of ears. Unfortunately, there was so much bad blood between himself and the child, that he knew it was not going to be so easy. This was more than a case of homesickness, that would mend itself in a day or two. And it was not as if Severus could pawn Potter off on Poppy, as he usually did with those students who seemed in need of more than a cup of tea. No, at the moment Potter was entirely his problem. "Did you call Granger?" Severus asked. It seemed as good an opening as any. Potter started, as though he'd forgotten Severus was there. "No. I suppose I forgot," he replied softly. "Call her in the morning, or she'll be thinking I chopped you into potion ingredients," grated Severus, and then, plowing ahead because he had to start somewhere, "You seem rather angry at Miss Granger. Any reason why?" Potter just stared at him for a minute. The boy's eyes narrowed. "I'm not angry at her," he said, gruffly. "So, you always call her names?" Severus settled back in his chair with his teacup. "That seems uncharacteristic." "What do you mean, call her names?" the boy asked indignantly. "During your episode," Snape sipped his tea, "although you did seem quite beside yourself. Perhaps you don't recall." Potter began, then he trailed off and shrugged. "In fact, I've noticed that there has been quite some distance between you and the rest of your housemates. You have become quite withdrawn." Severus was too tired to be anything but blunt. The boy shrugged again. "Perhaps she's done something to upset you," Severus pressed. Potter shook his head, remaining silent. Severus was trying to think of something else to say when Potter muttered, "She should just mind her own business," into his tea. "She is rather overly inquisitive." Severus watched the boy carefully. Potter had started to swing his feet back and forth, his mouth pulled down sharply. "What did you not want her inquiring about?" he asked, carefully. "Nothing." The boy's mouth twisted, as though overcome with some emotion. Severus didn't catch what it was. And then, he snarled, "She just shouldn't talk behind my back. That's not what friends do." Severus sipped his tea some more. "So, you're unpleased that she and the Weasleys went to Lupin with their suspicions?" "What, Percy went with them?" Potter asked, surprised. "No, the twins." Apparently those two reprobates have enough sense to talk to an adult when they feel something is badly wrong. So, the Weasley twins hadn't revealed their part in this to Potter. Severus thought that was very interesting. In fact, they were the most adamant that your guardians were less than adequate. Miss Granger seemed to lose her nerve a bit when she found out I was going to be part of the conversation. George and Fred talked to you? Potter asked, blankly. That surprises you. Belatedly, Severus remembered he had promised them anonymity. He went on softly, they were concerned for you. What did they tell you? Potter's voice was low, angry. He held his teacup tightly in two hands. They said that they rescued you from your relatives with their father's car. That at the time your aunt and uncle had been starving you and keeping you under lock and key. Severus looked into Potter's angry eyes. I don't understand why it concerns you so. This would have come out when you were examined regardless. Your relatives' mistreatment of you is written all over your body. Abruptly, Potter's shoulders dropped. I'm being stupid. I just wish. He trailed off, looking down. You and Lupin. You both went to the Dursleys. Severus wasn't sure where the boy had gotten that bit of information, but he saw no reason to deny it. Yes. Did Aunt Petunia show you my cupboard? The child asked harshly. Actually, no, replied Severus, calmly. You keep mentioning it, though. Why is that? Potter scowled and shot Severus a venomous look. He shut his mouth firmly and turned his gaze back to the fire. Do you often sleep on a settee rather than your bed? Severus asked, after a few moments. Potter nodded, a little sheepishly. I've always had trouble sleeping. Sometimes I just read in bed, but sometimes I feel too. I don't know, claustrophobic. So I go down to the common room and read until I fall asleep. Severus nodded, glancing again at the book Potter had chosen. He felt himself go still. It was one of the few works of fiction on his shelves. One of the books that Lily had given him. Severus forced himself to relax. It was not as though that was any surprise. Very few of the books in his library would be of interest to a 13-year-old boy, save the ones that Lily had given to Severus when they were teenagers. This whole damned house was haunted by memories. Professor, Potter asked, tentatively, why are there so many Muggle things in your house? My father was a Muggle, replied Severus, shortly. So, you did grow up here, then? The boy asked, interested, but, you don't talk like anyone around here. My mother was a witch. From quite an old family. Severus said, quietly, I prefer to be known for that in the wizarding world. Did you get on with your parents? Potter was getting dangerously close to subjects Severus would rather not speak of. I was quite close to my mother. Severus told the boy stiffly. My father was a difficult man. Potter looked hard at Severus. If the child had been older, Severus would have suspected him of attempting legilimency. Why do you ask, Potter? The boy blushed a little and looked away. You've been really decent this whole term, he said. I appreciate it. You aren't the first student I've had to temporarily take custody of. Severus urged him, leaving out the fact that Potter was the first student he'd taken permanent custody of. Potter looked back sharply, but Severus sighed. Unfortunately, there are abused children in every group of students. Teachers, especially heads of houses, look for the signs. Longbottom and yourself were, sadly, not spotted. I suspect because all of us, Severus inclined his head, waved his hand vaguely to include all of the adults in Potter's life, were not looking properly. The boy's whole mien changed. He stiffened, shifted forward until he was sitting on the edge of his seat, poised for flight. He put his teacup down and pulled the blanket closer around him. I'm not like Neville, he whispered. His face was very pale. Severus sincerely hoped he wasn't about to have another attack of his nervous stomach. Uncle Vernon, he only hit me once in a while. Most of the time he just shouted. It was never that bad. And depriving a child of food is an acceptable punishment, is it? Severus couldn't keep the sneer out of his voice, and didn't really try. I knew lots of people who got sent to bed without meals. Potter said petulantly. One meal, Severus grated. He wished they were back at Hogwarts, where he could send Potter off for a nice chat with Poppy or one of the other professors. I will guarantee that none of those children ever missed more than one meal. And, more than likely, they were merely deprived of their pudding, rather than the whole meal. Potter's eyes narrowed. and he seemed on the verge of fleeing, but he wasn't quite in flight, yet. While we're at it, referring to a child under your care as a freak is unacceptable among muggles and wizards, both. Petunia has always been a wretched, spiteful thing, Severus said, darkly. For a moment he wished he'd hexed the both of those horrors who called themselves Vernon and Petunia while he'd had the chance. He remembered Lily's face as she'd told Severus what Petunia had been calling her the summer after their first year. Potter sighed. Aunt Petunia just didn't like my magic. She couldn't help being. The boy paused as though thinking of something. You said you knew my grandparents. Didn't you? I knew them. Yes. Not well, but they were kind people, replied Severus cautiously. You knew my mum, then. Potter's eyes lifted, looking at Severus hopefully. You met at Hogwarts. We were in the same year, Severus admitted. A voice inside his head, that sounded remarkably like Lily, berated him for telling half-truths to the boy. You were friends? Potter asked. Severus clenched the hand that wasn't holding his teacup. The child dropped his eyes and cringed a little, as though he expected to be cuffed. Severus wondered what the child had read in his face. But then, the boy raised his chin, a little defiantly, his teeth set. It's very late, croaked Severus around an unaccountable lump in his throat. Finish your tea, and get to bed. For good measure, he slid the plate of tea biscuits he'd included on the tea tray towards the child. Eat something. I expect you don't eat enough at dinner and you wake up hungry. The boy's look of astonishment was again quite comical and Severus found himself having to suppress a smile. Snape didn't come down for breakfast the next morning. Harry woke up when the light was just turning from gray to red. He threw one of his jumpers over his pajamas and stuck his feet into the slippers that Snape had insisted on buying him. He quite needed them as he crept down to the kitchen. It was cold in this house. Yesterday, Harry had taken the liberty of filling the larder with his own favorite foods. Snape hadn't given him a shopping list, so he'd reckoned Snape didn't much care what he bought, as long as he was fed. At least, Snape hadn't complained about the meals Harry served him. So this morning, it was sausages and eggs for breakfast, with toast and jam. It was almost as good as Hogwarts food, even if Harry did say so himself. When the tea was made and the sausages finished cooking, Harry took Snape some breakfast up. That was better than lurking around the kitchen, waiting to see if the old bat was going to come down. Snape didn't move as Harry silently padded across the room to put the tray in the bread box. After Harry had finished his own breakfast and cleaned the kitchen, he sat at the table wondering what he should do with himself. Inactivity seemed intolerable. Snape hadn't left him with any lists like Petunia would, if she were going to be gone for the day. Harry had read ahead in all his clues and he certainly couldn't take his broom out. Generally, Harry wasn't one to get lonely. At the Dursleys, being alone meant he got some peace and quiet. At school, he was always surrounded by people. Being alone was actually hard to manage and a mostly welcome respite from the constant jostle of people. He wished Snuffles could have come with him, again. At the thought of Snuffles, Harry's got tight. Dumbledore had said the dog was gone for good. As though a bucket of water had been tipped over his head. Harry went cold, even with a warm breakfast in his stomach. Harry suddenly realized what the headmaster had been trying to say. A sob escaped his lips, before he could stop it. The pressure in his made him his breath in sharply. He closed his eyes and bent his head to the table. More sobs followed though he desperately tried to swallow them down. The last thing he wanted to happen was to have Snape find him crying. Harry put his hand over his mouth to stifle his noise, the way he might have at the Dursleys. He hadn't really cried in years. It didn't matter, he kept telling himself, not at all. He had more important things to be upset about. Neville was dead and Ginny had tried to do herself in. The Weasleys wouldn't be able to take him, and Snape was stuck with him. It didn't matter that his bloody dog was gone too. He still had Hedwig and he'd always looked after himself. His hands tingled as he tried to fight down his tears. His teacup, on the table, shook for a moment before exploding into tiny pieces of ceramic shrapnel that covered the table and spilled onto the floor. Harry stared at the pieces. Standing suddenly, he picked up the saucer and flung it against the wall. The sound of the breaking ceramic relieved the pressure in his head. It felt so good, he picked up the plate and flung it too. Another outburst of magic made the teapot crack with a pop. Harry picked up the sugar bowl, just about to fling it too, when the kettle started whistling. His magic had apparently heated the water to the boiling point, without the need for a flame. It was the sound of the kettle whistling that brought him to his senses. His wild anger was abruptly brought to heel by sudden terror. Snape was sure to hear him breaking up his kitchen. Plus, the last time he had done accidental magic, the minister himself had come looking for Harry. The summer before that, Dobby had gotten him blamed for a hovercharm and Harry had been threatened with expulsion from school. Harry stood listening, trying to hear over his hammering heart. There was no sound from upstairs. Perhaps the silencing spells worked between rooms. Maybe Snape was still so exhausted that nothing was going to wake him up. There was still no broom to be found, so Harry picked up what bits he could find, careful not to cut himself. He wished he dared use his wand, but he expected an owl from the ministry any second as it was. What would Snape do to him if he was expelled? The minutes ticked away, but there was no owl from the ministry swooping in. Perhaps it was going straight to Snape. Harry realized he was very cold. There was nothing he could do about owls from the ministry anyway. The dull numbness he'd been feeling since yesterday reared itself as his adrenaline faded. He threw the bits of teacup, saucer and plate into the rubbish, glad that he'd chosen to use the old-looking place setting he'd found in the kitchen, rather than the good china he'd found in the small dining room cabinet. He had put Snape's food on that. The house hadn't gotten any warmer, even with the sun shining through the kitchen window. Harry thought he remembered seeing something that looked like an electric thermostat in the hallway. He shivered, getting up to look around the short, dark page. He realized that even yesterday, he hadn't paid much attention to the house. The kitchen opened onto the hallway, with the front door directly across from it. It had a thin red runner carpet over a wooden floor. The living room door was directly to the left of it, as he faced it, and the stairs were facing the front door, with the dining room connecting the kitchen and living room. It actually looked a little like the front page of the Dursleys' house, only in reverse. A small cupboard that Harry hadn't taken any notice of was under the stairs. Snape was right about one thing. For some reason he kept dwelling on his cupboard. He hadn't even had to sleep in it since he came to Hogwarts, so why was it preying on his mind so? It had never seemed like that big a deal before. He spotted the small box on the wall, adjusted it up to 20 degrees. He hoped that Snape wouldn't complain that Harry was running the heat too high. At least he wouldn't have to build a fire in every room to make the place warm. Harry was beginning to feel like Snape's dusty house had hope of becoming habitable, and was sort of glad that Snape was staying out of the way. He still couldn't find a broom to sweep with, but he did find a floor brush under the sink. While he was shopping yesterday, he'd bought a bit of the floor cleaner Petunia favored. Scrubbing the floor would be something to do, for a bit. Before he started on it, he went upstairs, changed into the pair of jeans he wore yesterday and dug out his dragon hide gloves, remembering how harsh the stuff was. He smiled a bit grimly at himself, as he used the floor brush to attack the stains on the kitchen floor. He'd fallen pretty low to be voluntarily scrubbing a floor, but it was better than sitting around. Trouble was, scrubbing wasn't a task that would consume his in. His sleep hadn't been the slightest bit restful, and that conversation in the middle of the night with Snape had just been weird. He had not expected to be offered tea and biscuits by the man, ever. Most especially not in the middle of the night. Rather than think about everything else, he distracted himself with the questions last night's conversation had brought up. Snape had known his mother, had been friends with his mother, by the sound of it. And he knew Aunt Petunia. If Snape knew Petunia and his grandparents, it stood to reason that Snape had visited his mother at her house. At least it didn't sound like he'd only met them in Ping at the train station. Snape had never mentioned his mother before. Mrs. Cook seemed like she might be a good source of information, if Harry made friends with her. Yesterday she had been very kind to Harry, showing him where the shops were. He could have found them himself, but she seemed very interested in talking to Harry. Elderly women often liked Harry, if only because he was polite to them. Mrs. Cook had also shown Harry where the laundrette was the previous day, and he was anxious to get some of his things washed. It would give him an excuse to get out of the house. However, he might get some awkward questions about why he was hanging about if he went out in the morning, when everyone else his age was in school, so it was probably best to wait until later. It took the better part of the morning to get the floor something approaching clean, but it made the kitchen that much brighter, and he was able to pick up the bits of smashed crockery he'd missed. It was still a sort of gray, but the grime was mostly stripped from it. The sharp smell of the floor cleaner was almost comforting. When Harry had heard Snape in the shower around noon, he took in the sandwiches he'd made. Snape's bedclothes were tossed around again. The man was sleeping very badly, by the looks of it. Harry wondered if it was a result of the spell he'd used or if the professor was always a restless sleeper. Quickly, Harry stripped the bed and made it up with fresh sheets he'd found in a linen closet in the hall. Not a moment too soon. Snape emerged from the bathroom just as Harry was headed back down the stairs. He seemed to be moving with more of his accustomed grace. He was in his dressing gown with his hair damp from the shower. Snape gave Harry his potion ingredient look again, but asked civilly enough, "Are you all right, Potter?" Harry nodded, glad that Snape hadn't witnessed his earlier bout of tears, and it didn't sound as though he'd heard Harry chucking teacups. "Yes, sir," he mumbled, putting his hands deep in his pockets. Snape seemed like he was going to say something else, as he watched Harry with narrowed eyes. "What have you been up to?" he asked accusingly, after a minute. Harry shrugged. "Nothing." Snape's eyebrow went up. "Sir," Harry added belatedly. Snape made a noise in his throat. "I just received an owl," he said. Harry felt himself go white. He stared at Snape, waiting for the axe to fall. Snape must have seen Harry's reaction because he paused to look at him for a long moment, before continuing. "The headmaster is going to be here tonight." The trademark Snape sneer was back. Harry hadn't realized that it had been missing in his dealings with the potions master, until it returned. "He wants to see how we're getting on." Apparently, that bothered Snape for some reason. "He'll be here at 8 o'clock this evening. Do try to be present." Snape looked Harry up and down, and presentable, he sneered. Harry blushed. The knees of his jeans were filthy where he'd been on them scrubbing the floor. They were also the same ones he'd worn yesterday as was his t-shirt, so they were pretty dusty as well. Harry wasn't used to having clothes that it was even noticeable that they were dirty, at least not Muggle clothes. Harry nodded. "Yes, sir," he muttered sheepishly. "I trust you can keep yourself occupied for the afternoon?" Snape asked. Harry nodded, although for perhaps the first time in his life, he was running out of things to do. Harry found he could get the housework done very quickly when there was no Dudley to sabotage him. He thought he could get started organizing the cookbooks. He'd found that there were about 24 on a bottom shelf in the kitchen. They were printed on yellowing paper with very ordinary recipes. In the front of one was an inscription, "To my Eileen." Harry wondered who Eileen might be. No way he was going to ask Snape. Harry thought it might be all right if he tidied up the back garden. Mrs. Cook was the only one likely to see him, and even she'd have to be looking. Tall hedges obscured the view beyond the stone walls. The house on the other side was empty and an alley was the only thing on the other side of the tall wooden fence that ran across the end of the garden. Like the rest of the house, it had a feeling of long neglect. A little stone path, overgrown with weeds and half buried under soil, led to a dusty garden shed full of cobwebs and rusty tools. Harry had dug through the carelessly piled stack the day before. They were actually decent tools under the grime and rust. "All right then, Potter," nodded Snape. He hesitated. "I do appreciate that you have behaved yourself, thus far." It was odd to hear Snape say something that could be almost interpreted as praise. Snape didn't know about the accidental magic, then. Probably Dumbledore was coming to tell him himself, Harry mused gloomily. Snape was already looking tired again. "I'll leave you to it." He turned to walk back into his bedroom, pausing at the door. He clicked his tongue and huffed irritably. In a voice Harry was accustomed to hearing from Potions CL, he said, "If you are going to be here, I would expect the headmaster would appreciate a late supper. However, please remember that not all of us are partial to the overly sweet monstrosities Dumbledore prefers." And he shut his door before he'd even finished his own sentence. Another hot ball of anger ignited in Harry's stomach. That was a trick of Petunia's, to speak into the air rather than at Harry. Harry prevented himself from stomping down the stairs, with an effort. Snape was just a git. But that left him wondering what he was going to serve Dumbledore that Snape wouldn't hate. It didn't matter. Harry had decided by the time he'd showered and changed into something clean. He'd just get frozen meat pies like Petunia did when her book club met. And a fruit tart, and then they could please themselves. Petunia used to say that it didn't matter what you served, as long as it went on the good china. At 4 o'clock, Harry had finished the polishing the silver he'd found in the drawer of the dining room cabinet. He really wished Snape had a vacuum cleaner, but at least the dining room floor was bare wood. He used a cloth to pick up some of the dust. And there was a tablecloth in the drawer as well that Harry put on the table. He put a note onto the kitchen table, letting Snape know he was out at the shops, just to be safe. It took him only a little while to find what he was looking for. He bought enough frozen pies that he could serve them for dinner on a night he didn't feel like cooking. Heading back, he passed by a group of boys playing football in the park. Harry sighed, wishing he could be playing Quidditch, instead of stuck here. Mrs. Cook was just getting off her bus as Harry made it to Spinner's End. She saw Harry and smiled widely, reminding Harry of Molly Weasley. "Hello, Harry," she said, juggling several packages. Harry had his shopping in one bag. "Do you need help?" he asked politely, seizing his chance to be friendly. "Thank you, dear," smiled the old woman. "So how are you getting on?" "Been doing some shopping, again. And how is Professor Snape?" "I'm fine, thanks," Harry replied. "Professor Snape is feeling better, I think." Harry had told Mrs. Cook that Snape was down with a bad flu and that's why Harry was doing the shopping. "Well, if you need anything, you just come to me, mind." The woman shook her head. "So unfortunate that he had to become so ill when he had you to look after. I hope you're not sitting in front of the telly eating crisps all day." Harry hastened to rear her. "The headmaster's coming to visit this evening to check on us. And Professor Snape doesn't own a telly, but he's got loads of books." The last thing Harry needed was Mrs. Cook inquiring too closely about Snape and Snape's house. She nodded. "I'm not surprised. He was the same as a boy, you know. And his mum, Eileen, was such a brilliant woman." One mystery solved, Harry thought. Now there was only about 100 more to go. Of course, his father Toby worked at the mill, but we all knew that Severus was far too clever for that. And then I don't think Eileen's would have been happy with that either. I have an idea that her family was a bit posh, you see. We were never sure where Eileen came from. She never said, but she was a sweet girl, for all that. Mrs. Cook paused for breath. "But listen to me, I'm sure none of this interests you, dear. You're very tolerant of an old lady." Harry gave her a smile. "No, it is interesting. Professor Snape never talks about himself." As they came to her door, she fumbled around in her bag for her keys. "I'll make us some tea, shall I? Or is the professor expecting you straight back?" Harry shook his head. "That'd be great," he said, sincerely. Now that he had someone to give him some information, he wasn't going to let her stop. She took off her coat and put it in the hall closet, and turned to take Harry's, then beckoned him into the kitchen. Mrs. Cook's house was built on the same basic plan as Professor Snape's, but it was in immaculate order. She led him into the kitchen, which was much more modern and up-to-date than the one next door. She indicated the table to Harry. "Just put the things there, then," she said. Harry put her packages on the table, taking a seat. Mrs. Cook busied herself with the teapot. "So are your parents abroad, or something? Is that why you're staying with Professor Snape?" Harry was tempted to just say, yes, but then all kinds of questions would follow. "No," he told her quietly, "my parents died years ago. Car wreck." Mrs. Cook turned from the sink to give him a sympathetic glance. "Oh, I'm sorry dear," she said. "I used to live with my aunt and uncle, but they had to go away. They couldn't take me." Harry thought that sounded better than saying they didn't want him back. A lump came to his throat at the thought of that. "Used to live." Mrs. Cook was still looking at him. Harry felt his cheeks get hot, as he went over what he just said in his head. "Well, Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon, they..." Harry stumbled over his words, horrified to realize that his eyes had started to overflow. He didn't know what was wrong with him. Mrs. Cook turned back to the sink and washed some cups left in there. Harry took a few breaths, swiped at his cheeks. After a moment, Mrs. Cook said, "I knew a Petunia once." She spoke slowly as though thinking something through. "Your mum, would her name have been Lily?" Harry started. "Yes. How did you know?" I thought you looked a bit like an Evans. She sounded satisfied. Sorry. She turned back to look at him. An Evans, dear. She looked at him a little oddly. I can't imagine there would be two other sisters named Petunia and Lily. And, I heard Lily was killed in a car wreck. The last was said very gently. Aunt Petunia never told Harry about his grandparents. The old woman went on. They lived 2 streets over. Mr. Evans was a foreman at the mill for years. V and I were great friends. She got friendly with Eileen next door, when Lily was chosen to go to the same school as Severus. Professor Snape, I should say. She smiled at Harry. Well, I dare say, that explains why you came home with Professor Snape. It does, asked Harry, confused. Oh, yes, Severus and Lily were inseparable. For years. I know that Toby, that was Professor Snape's father, sort of hoped it would turn into something more. She paused, but Severus was never one to be involved with girls. I imagine his studies kept him occupied. Harry's mind whirled. Inseparable. Snape and his mum. But Mrs. Cook was continuing. Haven't seen Petunia since she married. She was always one to put on airs. She was friends with my Angie until she left school. Of course it was hard for her, after her mam and da died. Lily was still at school and they had the most dreadful argument at the funeral. Lily cleared out that night and Petunia put the house up for sale. Petunia never spoke to Angie much, after she married. I think she was ashamed of where she came from, to be honest. We only found out that Lily died because Angie ran into her once, when she was up in Surrey. Mrs. Cook looked at Harry with sudden comprehension. Oh, and I remember now, Angie said how put upon Petunia was that she got landed taking care of her nephew. Harry just stared at the woman, not knowing what to say. A firm knock at the door saved Harry from having to reply. Oh, excuse me, dear. Mrs. Cook said as she went to go get the door. The door opened, and Harry heard Mrs. Cook say, "Well, hello Severus. So nice to see you." Harry closed his eyes, wondering how much trouble he'd be in. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Cook," he heard Snape say, stiffly, "is my student here?" "Why, yes he is. I was just making a cup of tea, why don't you come in?" Mrs. Cook replied. Snape answered, "Thank you, but I'm afraid we don't have the time, just at the moment." "Ah, yes, Harry did say you were expecting company this evening." She paused, to ask Snape something in a low voice that Harry didn't catch. Harry stood up, moving closer to the door, to hear what they were saying, a conversation for another time. Snape replied, almost as softly. He raised his voice, "Mr. Potter, come along, the headmaster will be here early. He just phoned." There was the slightest of hesitation before Snape said the word, "phoned." "Yes, sir," replied Harry, sighing. He was glad he'd decided to do frozen pies, if the headmaster was going to turn up early. Snape stood on the steps in a black jumper and his wool trousers, still leaning heavily on his cane. His hair was pulled back again. Harry had to think it was because in Muggle clothes, if Snape wore his hair falling about his shoulders as he usually did, it would make him look like an aging hippie. Harry must have smirked involuntarily at that thought, because the professor scowled at him and said, "Something amusing you, Potter?" Harry shook his head. "No, sir," he replied meekly. Snape made a non-committal sound in his throat, turning back to Mrs. Cook. He said, "I hope he hasn't been troublesome." No, he helped me bring my shopping back. And it's so nice to meet one of Violet's grandchildren," the woman cheerfully replied. Snape looked at her sharply. "I beg your pardon." She smiled more widely. "Now Severus, it's not as though the boy doesn't look like an Evans. With those eyes, you can't miss it." Snape gazed beadily at Harry for a second, then completely floored Harry by smiling a little at the woman. "No, I suppose one can't." "Well, get on with you both," she said, kindly, "but why don't you come over for tea on Sunday? I'd love the company." Snape cleared his throat. "If we're still here. It's quite possible we'll be returning to school before then." "Of course." She nodded, looking a trifle disappointed. "Well, just let me know," she said, recovering. Harry grabbed his shopping from off the floor. They didn't speak until they were inside Snape's house. Harry couldn't gauge how much trouble he was in. Stony silences were so common with Snape. The minute they were in the door, Snape rounded on him. What the hell were you thinking? He hissed. Have you no sense of caution? Are you trying to get killed? He didn't wait for Harry to reply. You have a powerful dark wizard after your blood. What were you thinking? Harry began, as the professor turned to walk into the living room, and sit down heavily in the armchair. She did ask me to come in. She was really nice. I thought it would be rude not to. I didn't say anything. She could have easily been Sirius Black, Polyjuiced, or she could have been imperioused by him. Are you so starved for affection that you follow the first person who says a kind word to you into their home? Snape continued to glower at him. Harry couldn't think of a thing to say. It never occurred to him that he could be in danger from an old lady. Snape always managed to make him feel utterly pathetic. No sir, Harry replied quietly. Snape closed his eyes. Harry guessed that he was lucky that Snape still seemed so debilitated. It seemed like he didn't even have the strength to give Harry a proper telling off. Snape opened his eyes to fix Harry with a glare. Go. Get out of my sight, until the headmaster comes, he growled. Harry nodded. Quickly, he took the things to the kitchen, hastily turning the oven on and putting the frozen pies in them. He put the tart in the fridge. If the Dumbledore didn't show up by the time they were ready, Harry would retrieve the bread box from Snape's room to keep them warm. He put a kettle on, thinking perhaps the professor could do with some tea. That sometimes worked with Petunia, if not Vernon. He heard Snape moving around in the dining room. I assume someone taught you to count. Snape called loudly. There are going to be 3 of us here tonight. Harry had set 2 place settings at the dining table, umming that Snape wouldn't want him eating supper with them. Harry nearly went in to ask Snape about it, but then he remembered that Snape said he wanted Harry out of his sight. Harry wasn't stupid enough to question the man's orders to his face. And then, Snape said, if I have my way, this will be your last evening here. I'll have the headmaster take you in hand, and you can work in the kitchens at school. Well, thought Harry irritably, so much for our home. That didn't take long. Ungrateful git. For some reason, the thought of going back to Hogwarts with the headmaster didn't make Harry as happy as it should have. He was tired of other people sending him here and there. He also remembered what Molly Weasley had said the other morning, about Dumbledore sending him to the Dursleys in the first place. Harry's stomach was bubbling with hot, acid anger again. He waited until he heard Snape's footsteps go up the stairs, before he went into the dining room to lay another place at the table. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.